Story 1.
A wide pit opened in the rocky ground, shaped by natural erosion and expanded by human labor decades ago. The place was called the Pit Prison, though the official designation on legal documents used another term that nobody cared to memorize. The entrance was located at the top of a steep drop, where a wooden lift dangled on thick chains. Guards controlled the lift from a reinforced platform, watching inmates come and go with the same detachment they showed when they threw scraps of food into the dust. The wood on the lift was warped and damp, stained by the sweat of those who had ridden it downward for the last time. Inside the pit stretched a network of caves connected by slopes, jagged tunnels, and primitive ladders. Portions of the cave system reached hundreds of yards underground. Stale air made it difficult to breathe, and some passages contained pockets of foul-smelling water that collected in hollows. Light sources were limited to torches, improvised lamps fueled by leftover fats, and the occasional glow from a hole in the cavern ceiling. Guards rarely ventured past the top area, preferring to maintain control by limiting movement on the lift. The prisoners had formed a strict hierarchy. Several large gangs dominated the cavern's key areas, claiming the more accessible tunnels and the corners where water dripped from cracks in the ceiling. Smaller groups and lone inmates were forced to pay tribute in the form of supplies, stolen goods, or forced labor. Those who refused risked savage beatings. The guards allowed these internal rules to stand. Their interest was limited to keeping the numbers stable and ensuring no mass exodus ever occurred. Once a month, a motorized truck arrived near the edge of the pit. Bags of food and water jugs were shoved onto the wooden lift or tossed over the side without care. The guards bet on how many inmates would die during the scramble for the supplies. Thuds echoed through the deep shaft when the bags landed on bodies. The guards laughed as they observed the chaos, yelling at each other about the probability of broken limbs and spilled blood. Michael stood apart from this brutality. He had no gang, preferring to rely on his own instincts. He occupied one of the farthest caves, where he slept on a makeshift cot fashioned from old blankets and discarded metal rods. He had discovered a narrow tunnel behind a cracked boulder that led to a ledge slightly above ground level. From there, he could see much of the cavern floor. He had placed small rocks in piles along the approach to his cave so he would hear intruders. He lived without friends or allies. In the pit prison, friends were dangerous. That day, the monthly supply drop arrived. The first sack landed on an unlucky inmate, crushing his collarbone. Another rolled down a slope, trailed by 5 men. Within seconds, fists connected with jaws, and shouts filled the air. One bag opened on impact, spilling canned goods and water packs. Inmates pounced on them, only to be kicked aside by bigger men from the lead gangs. The guards roared with amusement. Michael waited in the shadows near a bend in the rock. When the fighting erupted, he monitored the swirling crowd. His mind stayed focused on the edges, knowing that lone survivors or opportunists might separate from the chaos. He spotted a man who had managed to snatch a sealed bag. This man clutched it against his chest while slipping around the outskirts of the brawl. Michael followed him for about 30 yards, watching the man's frantic steps. The man glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting to be ambushed. When the moment felt right, Michael lunged from behind, striking the man at the base of the neck with a short length of pipe. The blow knocked him to the ground. Michael seized the bag, then scanned his surroundings. He noted that nobody had seen him. Screams and combat still echoed from the center of the cavern. Michael retreated to his cave, breathing hard from the tension rather than the short struggle. Once inside, he placed the stolen bag on a flat stone shelf he used as a table. He knelt to check if the man had followed him, but the tunnel entrance was silent. Michael listened to faint sounds from the main cavern. He told himself that survival justified any action. He opened the bag and saw packets of dried food, several water pouches, and a few meager medical items. These were small treasures in a place where infection often led to a slow death. He stacked them meticulously, ensuring everything was in order. He recalled the past several years of his life, recognizing how much had changed. He rested on his cot, letting the adrenaline subside. His hands felt steady, and his mind sifted through possibilities. He had learned to live alone. He had no other choice in the pit prison. Michael remembered the day he was handed a sealed file in a dim office far from public view. The mission was clear: eliminate a powerful political figure who threatened the stability of a volatile region. Michael was a covert operative, trained to move without leaving traces. He had followed the instructions, stalked his target in distant suburbs, and carried out the plan with efficiency. His extraction was supposed to be swift and unnoticed. He recalled the signal to rendezvous on a deserted street corner. Nobody arrived. Instead, an armored vehicle blocked the road, and men with black uniforms aimed rifles at him. One of them called him by name and told him to drop his weapon. He complied, certain it was an unforeseen twist that would be resolved by the chain of command. He was wrong. They placed him in restraints and covered his head with a hood. He later learned the government that employed him had labeled him a threat. He had fulfilled his objective, and then he became an inconvenient witness. Documents with sensitive details had vanished, leaving him vulnerable. An official denied his existence, turning him from an asset into a liability. His pleas were ignored. The next thing he knew, he was in the pit prison, forced to ride the creaking wooden lift down into darkness. Now he existed in a place where no conventional law applied. The pit had its own rules, written by muscle and cunning. He recognized that his former training only gave him a slight advantage. Firearms were scarce, and the environment demanded a different survival approach. Negotiation, stealth, and observation became more important than direct confrontation. He had found ways to remain neutral in disputes. He provided small services to multiple groups, never giving them a reason to suspect disloyalty. He would pass along harmless pieces of intelligence about rival plans, carefully ensuring no one side gained too much power. He avoided revealing his past identity. He was simply Michael, a man who knew how to gather resources quietly. He spent days examining the labyrinthine layout of the caves. He discovered hidden passages where the rock formed narrow channels. He found spots where the humidity was lower, offering a drier place to store small rations. He learned that alliances were fragile. He also recognized that direct involvement with any gang placed him under permanent suspicion. Survival demanded distance. Over time, he developed a personal creed. No commitments, no friendship, no compromise. He had seen large men cripple smaller rivals for a handful of water. He had watched guards drop fresh supplies on top of unsuspecting inmates. His conscience had faded. He recalled the life he had before, but it felt distant. He no longer believed in honor. The pit allowed no illusions. He was still alive because he never stood still when danger approached, and he took from others before they could take from him. He now sat in his cave, staring at a small tin of protein powder he had stolen earlier. He recognized a simple truth. The skills he once relied on would not protect him indefinitely. Michael awoke to an unsettling quiet. He rose from his makeshift cot and peered out of the narrow passage that overlooked the main cavern floor. Dim torchlight cast long shadows against uneven walls. Movement was visible in the distance, where a few individuals scurried toward a known trading spot near the southeast tunnels. In the pit, each day presented a fresh hazard. There was no unified administration among the inmates. Gang leaders set their own rules, enforced by threats and daily acts of violence. The guards above tolerated these arrangements because they benefited from stable inmate populations and contraband schemes. No official code existed. Strength, strategy, and intimidation decided who ate and who starved. The largest gangs shaped much of life in the pit. The brown shirts, composed of men who boasted about their extremist views on race and power, dominated certain weapon trades. They crafted knives and sharpened steel spikes out of leftover metal scraps. They also demanded tribute from weaker inmates, promising protection in return. Michael had seen them roam the corridors, targeting anyone who did not pay their weekly ration of food or stolen goods. Their presence created a climate of fear. Another dominant group was the Red Killers, made up mostly of men who came from the inner cities. Their leader controlled a portion of the monthly supply drops by stationing his most loyal members near the central drop zone. They seized the largest share of the supplies, selling or trading them later. Water, especially, was sold at high rates, and many inmates were forced into debt. Anyone who attempted to bypass their distribution was beaten. The Red Killers had a strict hierarchy that demanded loyalty and obedience. The Irish Brigade operated on different principles. They specialized in outside connections, slipping bribes to certain guards in exchange for goods that were rarely found in the pit. Cigarettes, liquor, and limited medication arrived in hidden crates and changed hands through back corridors. Their leader maintained a careful balance by collaborating with other influential gangs, ensuring nobody singled out the Irish as an easy target. Rumors existed that the Irish Brigade possessed the means to arrange a quiet exit from the pit for a significant price, though no one had ever publicly confirmed such a transaction. Another group, the Silent Dragons, ran gambling rings and produced narcotic compounds from fungi and odd plants that grew in damp corners of the caves. They operated discreetly. Their presence was felt through the swirling tension of drug disputes that erupted among inmates who owed them money. The dragons rarely announced their power through open displays of violence. They simply found those who failed to pay, and those individuals never reappeared. Smaller bands drifted between these main factions. Some were united by shared nationality, some by old bonds from life on the outside. They claimed minor tunnels and staked out sections that others deemed less profitable. They survived by staying neutral or by offering specialized services. Information was valuable, as was skill in forging tools or cultivating hidden patches of edible fungus. Michael had no desire to join any of these groups. He recognized the constant betrayals and the paranoia that infected everyone who lived in this place. He observed their movements from a distance. He rarely entered the so-called market, but he knew it was a critical zone for transactions. Stalls lined the edges of a broad chamber. Some sold makeshift weapons. Others sold diluted liquor that could ease physical pain for a short while. There were corners where rumors spread quickly. Prisoners whispered about possible escape routes or new contraband shipments from the guards. On certain nights, the market offered crude entertainment. People gambled, made bets, and occasionally staged fistfights for small prizes. Behind the surface, a stark reality prevailed. The bigger gangs set extortion prices on water and food. Anyone violating their terms risked death or exile to the darkest areas of the pit, where cave-ins and foul air were common. Michael had come close to being trapped there once, years ago, while trying to evade a group that demanded half his rations. He had escaped by crawling through a tight crevice, emerging with scraped elbows and bruises along his back. he continued living as a lone survivor. He found side pathways where few ventured. He stole supplies when the opportunity arose. He observed the tension between gangs, recognizing that alliances shifted frequently. He saw men align with one group, then desert them for a better offer, only to be hunted down later. In this environment, trust did not exist. Power belonged to those who seized it without hesitation. That morning, he watched a cluster of armed inmates block access to a well near the north wall. They belonged to a smaller band that wanted to establish a new toll. An argument broke out, followed by a short brawl. One man collapsed, clutching his side. Blood pooled beneath him. The others grabbed weapons and prepared to retaliate. This scene reminded Michael that the pit was a kind of arena, lacking any moral restraint. That realization echoed through his mind each time he saw cruelty become routine. He drew back into his cave, aware that survival depended on maintaining a low profile. He heard distant shouts and recognized the dull thud of a club meeting flesh. The pit was not a place for mercy. Resources were finite. Everyone had their own code, shaped by hunger and desperation. Michael quietly waited, calculating his next steps. He understood that existing alone in these conditions required constant vigilance, but he also believed it was safer than relying on others who would betray him for a morsel of bread. A man named Rook sat in a makeshift booth constructed from scrap lumber and sheet metal. This was one of many stalls in the bustling black market located in a widened chamber that echoed with low voices and the clang of improvised tools. Rook specialized in sneaking contraband through hidden arrangements with certain guards. He paid them generously with stolen goods or currency smuggled in from outside. Inmates came to him for items that could not be obtained in regular trade, such as special blades, rare booze, or advanced medical supplies. Michael stood near a corner, observing the flow of commerce. He saw men barter chunks of dried meat for battered water jugs. One stall sold sharpened rods and another dealt in homemade bandages. Alcohol was popular, though much of it was impure. The smell of cheap liquor floated through the chamber. The black market also included places where inmates engaged in gambling. Rook's table was stacked with battered crates, and his runners haggled with customers to finalize prices. Farther down, the brown shirts controlled a section where they displayed their homemade weaponry. They maintained a strict lookout to prevent theft. Prisoners looking to acquire knives or spike-studded clubs needed to pay in supplies or personal belongings. Some exchanged clothing, trading warmth for protection. Michael noted a separate stall where opium-like narcotics changed hands, managed by a subgroup associated with the Silent Dragons. The pungent odor from that area created a haze that lingered along the ceiling. Guards rarely appeared this deep in the pit. They understood the economy here served their interests as well. Bribes, stolen valuables, and illicit payments ensured that the contraband pipeline remained open. Certain gangs could offer the guards labor or even savage entertainment, enabling the men above to maintain a steady income. Rumors suggested that sometimes guards staged fights in the pit for wealthy spectators on the outside, but Michael had never witnessed such a spectacle. He dismissed many rumors as exaggerations from inmates seeking attention. Within this setting, the big gangs asserted dominance over certain goods. The Red Killers demanded a percentage from every vendor who sold food or water, and the Irish Brigade maintained quiet influence by circulating whiskey and pills at premium prices. The brown shirts established a presence wherever weapons were forged or sold. The Silent Dragons had discreet agents who monitored gambling tables, collecting debts when individuals could not pay. Michael understood that his survival depended on not crossing these organizations. He preferred to remain invisible when possible. He purchased small necessities without drawing attention. He sometimes traded information about the location of hidden caches or stashes left behind by careless newcomers. This approach kept him outside direct conflict. After finishing an exchange of cigarettes for a modest ration of preserved bread, Michael walked back through the winding paths, noting how certain areas were lit by flickering torches. He listened to whispered negotiations between smaller bands seeking alliances against stronger groups. He also watched for sudden bursts of violence, which often erupted if someone refused to pay a toll or attempted to steal. Along one passage he saw a group of frightened inmates. They had been exiled from a gang for breaking some unwritten rule. Their faces were gaunt and their clothing torn. They lingered near the darkest part of the tunnel, uncertain whether to flee deeper or return and beg forgiveness. Exile in the pit was usually a death sentence. No safe zone existed beyond the established territory. Michael silently passed them. He recognized that intervening would yield no benefit. Compassion was dangerous in a place where debts rarely went unpaid. By the time he returned to his solitary corner, he had witnessed more evidence that the pit operated on fear, greed, and an endless cycle of dominance. He understood that each transaction at the black market was a negotiation for survival. Consequences followed every deal. Anger flared quickly, and hidden loyalties sparked sudden betrayals. He remembered that truth from his own mistakes in the past. He chose to remain watchful and quiet. He settled into his small cave at the edge of a narrow passage and observed a pair of distant torches flickering against the walls. He knew this was not merely a prison. It was a reflection of how people behaved when confined without laws or hope. He had learned to adapt, forming temporary connections without trusting anyone. He believed that the pit was a proving ground that demanded constant vigilance. He had no illusions about escape. Michael left a corner booth where he had been gambling with 3 men. The makeshift bar that housed the booth stood in a neutral section of the pit, at least nominally. It was constructed from stacked rocks and salvaged steel. Its floor was uneven, and the seating consisted of crates or broken chairs scavenged from the dump site near the lift. The place attracted inmates seeking a short distraction through cards, dice, or strong alcohol that numbed the senses. The overhead torches flickered, creating shifting shadows on the walls. Michael had spent the last hour focusing on the card game, hoping to distract himself from the constant pressures of life here. He had earned a handful of cigarettes and lost half of them in a subsequent round. Overall, he considered it a fair outcome. He wanted to leave before the tension escalated, as it often did when players started accusing each other of cheating. He stepped into the damp corridor. It smelled of wet stone and stale sweat. The voices from the bar receded behind him. He adjusted his jacket, which was patched and worn from years of rough living, then began walking toward the path that would eventually lead to his hidden cave. He rounded a bend and nearly collided with a tall man who stumbled forward, reeking of alcohol. Michael recognized the man as the leader of a smaller but aggressive faction that had recently aligned with the brown shirts. The man's eyes were red and his breath was labored. He bumped Michael's shoulder and demanded an apology. Michael paused, trying to calm the situation by stepping aside and indicating he was leaving, but the leader grew agitated. When the leader tried to shove him again, Michael resisted by gripping the man's wrist. This triggered a string of curses from the leader, who yelled for his men. Within moments, 3 gang members emerged from a side passage. They cornered Michael in a confined area where the walls narrowed. One of them brandished a jagged piece of metal with taped cloth as a handle. Another clenched his fists. Michael recognized that negotiations were pointless. The leader kept shouting, calling Michael a coward who needed to learn respect. Michael kept silent, waiting for an opening. The first attacker lunged, swinging the sharpened metal. Michael sidestepped and brought his elbow down on the attacker's forearm. The weapon clattered on the ground. Another attacker tried to pin Michael's arms, but Michael slammed his heel against the man's kneecap. The man howled in pain and collapsed. The leader advanced, throwing a punch at Michael's abdomen. Michael managed to block part of the blow, though pain rippled through his midsection. He staggered but recovered his footing. He seized a broken plank lying against the wall. He swung it upward, catching the leader across the shoulder. The man groaned and stumbled backward, losing his balance. Michael used that moment to retrieve the dropped metal shard. He gripped it firmly, ignoring the sweat on his palms. One gang member rushed him. Michael slashed at the man's ribs. The improvised blade cut through fabric and caused the attacker to double over in agony. Another man grabbed at Michael's neck. Michael twisted sideways, slamming his forearm into the attacker's face. That man's head jerked back, and Michael felt a dull thud as bone or cartilage gave way. The corridor echoed with shouts. Michael glimpsed the leader rummaging for a weapon. A small blade flashed in the leader's hand. He slashed at Michael's torso, and the tip sliced open Michael's jacket. Michael reversed his grip on the shard and stabbed the leader's thigh. The leader cried out, dropping his knife. Michael realized he was outnumbered and needed to escape, so he turned to break away from the corridor. One more gang member tried to block his path. Michael tackled him, and the force of impact knocked them both against the rock wall. In the confusion, Michael drove the shard into the man's side. The man fell, and Michael sprinted down the passage, breathing heavily. He looked over his shoulder and saw the leader leaning against the wall, clutching his wounded leg. At least one of his followers lay unmoving on the ground. The others were moaning and rolling in pain. Michael felt the weight of the moment. He had taken a life. He had also severely injured the faction leader, an act that would carry serious consequences in the pit. He ran through the dim passages, weaving around boulders and slipping past inattentive lookouts. By the time he reached his hidden cave, he was gasping for air. His throat felt tight, and his chest heaved as he considered what had just happened. He understood that this act could spark a relentless hunt. He sat on his cot and removed his torn jacket, revealing a shallow cut on his side. He cleaned the wound with water from a plastic pouch. The sting reminded him that he was still alive. He slumped against the rough wall, anticipating the anger that would soon explode among the gang's members. He realized his next steps were crucial. This was no longer a matter of random theft or quiet survival. He had stirred a hornet's nest. His heart pounded and his mind raced. He checked his limited supplies, certain that it was only a matter of time before they came for him. He weighed his odds of finding a safer part of the pit or trying to hide in deeper tunnels. He understood there was no safe option. The pit was a closed world, and he had just made a significant enemy. Night fell without ceremony. At the rim of the pit, a heavy truck rolled to a stop, its engine rumbling beneath reinforced plating. A few guards stood near its doors, each armed with rifles and handheld spotlights. They did not bother with the wooden lift this time. Instead, they positioned themselves along the edge, hooked thick cables to an enormous iron container, and shoved it over the side. The box plummeted 20 feet before striking an outcropping, then tumbled another 10 yards, eventually slamming onto the rocky floor with a thunderous crash. Dust and shattered rock fragments erupted, rising in the stale air like a signal flare. Within minutes, curious inmates moved toward the sound. Iron was a rare commodity in the pit, and many believed they could strip the container for parts or transform it into shields or weapons. Tension spread through the small groups of prisoners who approached from different directions. Some carried crude implements, pipes, or sharpened rods, aware that competition over valuable materials often ended in bloodshed. The container's surface bore deep dents from the fall, but its seams remained intact. A group of 4 men circled the box, prodding it with metal bars to test for hidden compartments. They heard a faint scraping noise from within, like claws or nails raking the interior walls. Instead of retreating, they crowded around the reinforced corners. One of them pried at a small latch, hoping for a quick payoff. Another man hammered away at a hinge with a stone. They whispered among themselves, speculating about the contents. Some believed the guards had dropped new supplies or specialized tools. Others thought it might be a trick, another sadistic game to incite violence. They shared no consensus, yet greed outweighed caution. The scraping sounds continued, more insistent this time, as though something inside recognized the attempts at forced entry. Several onlookers stood at a safe distance, preferring to watch rather than participate. They heard a man cursing as he chipped away at a corner rivet. When part of the box gave way, a foul stench leaked out. It drifted across the stagnant air, causing a few men to recoil. The ones holding rods and stones paused, uncertain whether to continue. Then one of them, emboldened by the potential reward, slid a crowbar under the exposed seam and pried it open. Within a moment the stench intensified, thick and nauseating. The men coughed, some covering their faces with scraps of cloth. An uneasy silence followed. Then the box jerked from the inside, rattling with sudden force. The watchers froze, staring at the container. The scraping turned frantic, accompanied by muffled thuds that reverberated through the iron walls. As the men prepared to pry it further, the scene abruptly ended in confusion. The guards above switched off their spotlights, plunging that sector of the pit into near darkness. At dawn, a group of inmates investigating the site discovered the container torn apart. Its walls had been peeled outward, leaving twisted sheets of iron scattered across the ground. Several corpses lay nearby, barely recognizable. Limbs and torsos were shredded, as if subjected to fierce rending. A broken crowbar was found lodged in a jagged edge of the box. Blood splattered the dusty floor in wide arcs. The discovery caused immediate panic among the remaining population. Word traveled through every tunnel and cavern, reaching corners where news rarely spread. One rumor claimed that the guards had introduced a monstrous creature to cull the inmate count. Another rumor suggested something more supernatural. An unknown predator carried from a distant facility. People shared wild theories without tangible proof. Prisoners who prided themselves on bravery suddenly refused to wander alone. The few who had carved out small territories retreated closer to their allies, guarding entrances with sharpened stakes or crude booby traps. Even the big gangs, usually eager to assert control, showed caution. None of them had a clear explanation for the mangled bodies. Some insisted it was an attack by rival factions, but the nature of the wounds hinted at something else entirely. Throughout these developments, Michael remained in hiding. He had spent the nights lying low in his remote cave, ensuring his presence stayed invisible. He had no reason to approach the site of that crash, given his own troubles with a vengeful gang. He avoided large gatherings and listened for news from passing inmates, who spoke in hushed tones about the horrific display in the pit's center. He concluded that whatever was inside that box had been lethal enough to slaughter anyone reckless enough to pry it open. Though Michael did not fully grasp the extent of the threat, he recognized that tension in the pit was rising to a new level. Violence was not unusual, but the unexplained savagery unsettled even the most hardened killers. For now, Michael intended to continue evading his pursuers and minding his own survival. That single-minded approach had kept him alive this long. He expected that soon, however, circumstances would force him to confront the unknown terror. Michael spent 3 days confined to his cave, nursing minor wounds and rationing the limited provisions he had. He was aware that the gang he had provoked still wanted him dead. Yet isolation brought complications. Supplies were running low, and he needed to make a move before hunger or thirst weakened him. He decided to seek out his friend, a resourceful trader named Dixon, hoping to leverage an item he had stolen weeks ago, a small pouch of gunpowder, rare in the pit. Under cover of dim torchlight, Michael ventured into the network of passages leading to the black market. His goal was to remain hidden, so he avoided well-traveled corridors. He crawled through partially collapsed tunnels, squeezed through gaps where loose rocks threatened to bury him, and paused whenever he heard distant echoes of voices. Eventually, he reached the fringes of the market area. Something felt off. The once bustling zone was strangely subdued. Several stalls stood empty. The hush unsettled him more than any brawl would have. He spotted Dixon near a makeshift table, hurriedly packing small bottles into a sack. The trader looked anxious, glancing around as if expecting trouble. Michael approached carefully, scanning for watchers. When Dixon realized who stood behind him, he exhaled in relief, but urged Michael to keep his voice down. Dixon explained that people were terrified by a series of brutal killings. Those who discovered the battered iron box realized it contained some kind of creature, and at least 2 more savage deaths had occurred since. Dixon mentioned seeing half-eaten remains near a side tunnel. Everyone suspected the guards were behind it, but nobody knew their plan. Most inmates feared leaving their hiding places. The guards themselves seemed content to watch events unfold. Meanwhile, rumors of a second iron box had surfaced. Anxiety rippled through the pit, fueling paranoia and violence. Michael acknowledged Dixon's words, but told him that he had a more immediate concern. He still faced a death sentence from the gang he had attacked. He needed to negotiate protection or find an ally strong enough to counter that gang's influence. He revealed the small pouch of gunpowder, holding it out as proof that he had valuable currency to offer. Dixon studied the pouch, then nodded. Gunpowder in the pit was a major advantage, especially for a gang with ambitions to intimidate rivals. Dixon cautioned Michael that forging alliances during this climate of fear was risky. He knew of one group with enough resentment against Michael's enemies to consider a deal. However, they would demand a steep price and might betray him if circumstances changed. Michael accepted the risk. He had no other option. Before they parted, Dixon led Michael to a quieter corner and briefed him on the location of that group's hideout. Michael would need to travel deeper into an interconnected cluster of caves near a large underground pool. Dixon agreed to arrange a short meeting, but warned that they were jumpy about strangers. Michael thanked him, promising to repay the favor in any way he could. Then Dixon departed, anxious to relocate his merchandise and lie low. Michael made the return journey to his cave, moving with caution through echoing corridors. He noticed fresh graffiti scrawled on the walls, references to a demon dog or a monstrous beast with claws. He also spotted fewer roving inmates. People seemed to vanish into their hideouts, unwilling to roam. One man stumbled by, his face etched with tension. He mumbled warnings about seeing a massive shape dart across an intersection moments earlier. Reaching his cave, Michael set the gunpowder pouch on a flat stone and considered his next steps. The situation felt more volatile than anything he had experienced before. He recognized that the best strategy was to act quickly. Prolonged waiting would allow the gang to pinpoint his location, or worse, allow the unknown creature to appear without warning. he decided to focus on the upcoming negotiation. If he could gain temporary shelter by trading the gunpowder, he might create enough breathing room to outlast the immediate threat. He would handle the question of the new horror in the pit after securing his own safety. That night, he lay awake, listening for unusual sounds. Every distant shuffle in the darkness raised his anxiety. He realized the pit had evolved into something even more dangerous, overshadowed by an unseen predator. Despite his training, he felt vulnerable. Yet he reminded himself that he had endured harsh conditions before, and he intended to do so again. At dawn, he would leave for the rendezvous, prepared to risk his most precious resource in exchange for a shred of protection. Michael left his cave before dawn, choosing a winding path that skirted known gang checkpoints. He moved carefully, aware that at least 2 factions were hunting him. He reached a narrow passage where damp walls glistened under the minimal light from overhead fissures. He paused there, thinking he heard quiet footsteps. 2 men emerged, both wearing ragged shirts and carrying short blades. They belonged to the group that wanted him dead. He slipped into a shadowed alcove, pressing against wet stone. His heart pounded, but he remained motionless. The men lingered nearby, muttering about orders to capture or kill. Their voices sounded tense, possibly reflecting the growing panic in the pit due to unknown assailants. After a moment, one man suggested checking the next corridor. Footsteps receded. Michael intended to wait longer, but a sudden growl shattered the silence. It echoed down the tunnel, deep and guttural. The men shouted, followed by abrupt screams. The horrifying commotion lasted just a few seconds. Then everything went quiet. Michael clenched his fists and considered fleeing, but the risk of making noise was too great. He stayed put. When the silence persisted, he forced himself to investigate. He advanced slowly and found dark stains on the ground. There were scattered footprints leading deeper, though no bodies remained. This evidence suggested that the rumors of a vicious creature were true. Fear coursed through him, but he recognized that leaving the area immediately was wiser than standing around. He resumed his journey, keeping a watchful eye on every intersection. Hours later, he met Dixon near the mouth of a lower tunnel. Dixon looked agitated, explaining that overnight another iron box had been dropped into the pit. This time, some inmates claimed to have witnessed something tearing its way out from inside, then vanishing into the darkness. The news magnified the sense of dread, yet there was no turning back. Dixon guided Michael to the hideout where the prospective ally waited. The hideout stood behind a barricade of corrugated metal and broken beams. Guards armed with spears and makeshift crossbows stared suspiciously at Michael. Dixon explained the arrangement, but the guards insisted on seizing everything of value before allowing entry. They took the gunpowder pouch and roughly searched Michael for hidden weapons. Inside a dim chamber, Michael was confronted by a man flanked by 2 watchful sentinels. The man wore a stained jacket and had a deep scar across his brow. Michael attempted to introduce himself, but one of the sentinels struck him in the abdomen, causing him to stagger. The leader motioned for silence and demanded to see what Michael was offering. A guard handed him the pouch. Michael tried to keep his voice steady. He proposed an alliance. In exchange for the gunpowder, the group would offer temporary protection against the gang that sought him. The leader stared at the pouch, considering its implications. Gunpowder had the potential to create bombs or enhanced weapons, which could shift power in the pit. Before anyone could finalize a deal, another guard entered, whispering urgent news into the leader's ear. Apparently, the monstrous attacks were escalating, and multiple gangs had agreed to a temporary ceasefire. Michael's enemies were now part of that ceasefire, meaning the leader had no desire to antagonize them. He thanked Michael for the valuable pouch, but stated he would not interfere in the conflict. Michael realized he had been double-crossed. A swift blow knocked him to the ground. The guards kicked him until he felt his ribs protest. They wrenched his arms behind his back and bound him. Dixon tried to intervene, but was shoved aside. The leader declared they would deliver Michael as a gift to the rival gang, thereby avoiding any vendetta. Michael lay on the cold stone, helpless. They dragged him to a side chamber and locked him inside. The space was narrow, its walls damp and slimy. A feeble torch flickered near the entry, highlighting the fact that escape would be difficult. Rope burns stung Michael's wrists. He cursed his own desperation for trying such a naive plan. He had effectively handed his only leverage to a group that cared nothing for him. Outside, he heard the leader instructing men to contact Michael's enemies. Soon they would take him away and likely kill him. Hours passed while he wrestled with regret. He recalled how he once operated as a meticulous covert agent, always anticipating betrayal. Years in the pit had dulled that edge, leaving him vulnerable to false hope. He tried not to panic, forcing himself to breathe calmly and ignore the throbbing pain in his sides. Then, faint screams echoed from somewhere beyond the barricade. Men shouted, steel clashed on stone, and muffled detonations shook the cave walls. Something had attacked the hideout. Michael waited, realizing he had no means to fight back. All he could do was listen to the chaos outside, bracing for whatever came next. Michael lay face down on the rough floor, arms bound behind him, cursing his own carelessness. He had traded away the only real advantage he possessed. His chest hurt, and each breath reminded him of bruised ribs. He attempted to shift position, but the rope cut deeper into his wrists. The distant sounds of carnage intensified. Frantic footsteps, desperate shouts, and the guttural snarls of some unknown terror. He heard a sudden crack as the flimsy door to his makeshift cell split apart. A figure rushed in, breathing hard. It was Dixon, clutching a bent crowbar and frantically scanning the cramped space. Dixon knelt beside Michael and slashed the rope with a small knife. Michael winced but remained silent, trying to steady himself. Dixon urged him to hurry, explaining that the hideout had been overrun. They emerged into a corridor streaked with blood and debris. Several men lay on the ground, torn apart as though a wild animal had ripped them. A larger figure moved in the distance, hidden by flickering shadows. Dixon said there were now two such creatures roaming the pit. He had witnessed both. One had stormed this hideout, tearing through guards as if they offered no resistance. Everyone was too frightened to mount a coordinated defense. Michael saw the stolen pouch of gunpowder near a dead guard's outstretched hand. However, the guard's chest was torn wide, making any attempt to retrieve the pouch risky. A short distance away, the leader of the hideout was hurling desperate threats at the intruder. He lit a rag stuffed into a small tin can, presumably containing the precious gunpowder. Then he hurled it toward the monstrous shape bounding through the corridor. Michael and Dixon ran. Behind them came a sharp blast. The explosion rattled the walls, scattering dust and shrapnel. The sound hurt their ears, but they kept moving. Flames licked the lower part of the passage, igniting loose cloth and splintered wood. Screams of agony reverberated behind them. They found an exit that opened onto a broader tunnel. The floor was littered with broken weapons and spilled supplies. Michael spotted a half-crumbled walkway leading upward. They climbed it, coughing through acrid smoke and stepping over bodies. Above, a narrow archway offered a path back toward more familiar caverns. Pounding footsteps and echoing roars followed them. Pieces of the hideout collapsed, sending reverberations through the rock. Michael's side ached, and he labored to stay upright. Every step felt like a gamble. They finally escaped the immediate danger zone, pausing in a deserted corridor. Dixon leaned against a wall, struggling for breath. Michael realized that the threat in the pit was more real than any rumor. These beasts, with their canine features, possessed strength and agility far beyond normal predators. They slaughtered entire groups of hardened inmates, leaving little chance to fight back. He remembered news of multiple iron boxes dropped by the guards. He now suspected a grim intention behind those deliveries. They retreated to Dixon's hidden shelter. Inside, they barricaded the entrance with large rocks. Michael leaned against the wall, exhausted and shaken. Dixon began pacing back and forth, distressed by the carnage they had just witnessed. Michael stared at the flickering light of the small lantern, realizing that everything had changed. Unfortunately, Dixon's shelter was located not far from the marketplace, and this troubled Michael. From outside came muffled sounds of ongoing chaos. Distant shouts, scattered gunfire from improvised weapons, and the disturbing scrape of something heavy moving through the pit. Michael, still battered from the recent fight, sat on an overturned crate while Dixon rummaged for supplies. They had little food left, just a few cans of dried beans and a container of stale water. They each possessed a short blade, but neither believed these crude weapons would offer much help if the creatures attacked again. Their conversation was hushed, reflecting the tense atmosphere that now dominated the pit. After a few hours of uneasy rest, Michael concluded that staying in Dixon's chamber was too dangerous. If a band of survivors came looking for supplies, or if one of the beasts followed the lingering scent of blood in the tunnels, they would be cornered. He explained that he had a more isolated hideout on the pit's outer rim, far from the central passages. Though it lacked many amenities, it would provide better concealment and fewer potential intruders. Dixon agreed, recognizing that any chance to escape the central war zone might improve their odds of surviving. They gathered their meager belongings, small water flasks, the remaining food, and anything that could serve as a weapon or tool. Then they prepared for a journey through the collapsed sections and unguarded corridors. They hoped to avoid detection by any roaming inmates or the dog-like creatures, which Dixon had begun calling the Devourers. Michael nodded at the term. It felt accurate, given the gruesome remains they had seen. They left the chamber, stepping into what used to be the fringes of the marketplace. The sight that greeted them resembled a battlefield. Torn bodies lay scattered, and broken stalls had been reduced to smoking wreckage. Several fires burned out, leaving smoldering piles of ash. Occasionally, they saw a flicker of movement among the bodies, but no one appeared to be alive. A short distance away, Michael noticed a charred sign from the bar he had once visited. The entire structure had collapsed. They continued carefully, moving in short bursts from one piece of cover to the next. The pit's lighting was sporadic at best, with many torches extinguished or knocked over. Dixon held a small battery-powered flashlight he had traded for long ago, providing a narrow beam to guide them. The risk of attracting unwanted attention was high, but they needed to see where they were stepping. Near the remnants of a collapsed stall, they discovered the body of the gang leader who had been hunting Michael. His face was twisted in terror, and deep gashes streaked across his torso. Around him lay several of his men. Michael realized the vendetta was now irrelevant. This man's personal hatred had been overshadowed by a larger menace. Michael pointed out that, at least for now, they no longer had to worry about that gang's pursuit. Dixon agreed, though the relief felt hollow. A sudden impact from above made them freeze. Something crashed onto the stone floor not far ahead, The figure, battered and barely recognizable, emitted a sickening thud. Whoever it was had been dropped or flung from an unseen height. Michael and Dixon looked up, spotting a hulking shape clinging to the cavern wall. The creature's limbs extended unnaturally, and its fur bristled under the weak light. It resembled a monstrous wolf, yet it moved like a twisted version of a human. Saliva dripped from its jaws as it stared at them. They stepped backward, but another creature emerged from behind an overturned cart, blocking any retreat. The two beasts began to circle, their clawed hands scraping the stone and leaving marks. Michael tightened his grip on his blade, but he knew how futile it would be. Dixon crouched, eyes darting for an escape route that did not exist. The animals closed in, growling with a low rumble that shook the air. Michael felt his stomach clench. A wave of hopelessness settled over him as he realized they stood no chance in a direct encounter. The creatures, cunning and heavily muscled, prepared to spring. Before they could strike, a piercing whistle rang out. The sound reverberated through the chamber, loud and jarring. Both beasts halted, their ears flicking in response. Another whistle blast followed. The creatures twitched, snarled, then backed away, still watching Michael and Dixon. They retreated toward the cavern wall and climbed out of sight with terrifying ease. Moments later, the echo of a mechanical lift descended from above, accompanied by the raised voices of several guards. Spotlights swept the area, illuminating the wreckage. Michael and Dixon crouched behind a splintered beam, uncertain whether to reveal themselves. They watched as uniformed guards guided large iron cages that were lowered by chains. With firm gestures, the guards blew on the whistle again. The creatures reappeared, scaling down from hidden ledges and stepping into the cages as if following a trained command. The guards locked the containers and used hand signals to hoist them back up. The entire procedure unfolded with cold precision. Once the cages vanished into the darkness above, the guards departed without bothering to check for survivors. The hum of the lift faded, leaving silence in its wake. Michael and Dixon exchanged a tense glance. They realized these monsters were not random abominations, but part of some orchestrated plan. The pit was a testing ground, and the guards had full control. Suddenly, the perspective shifted. A cramped office full of surveillance monitors showed real-time feeds of every corner of the pit. Guards staffed rows of equipment, jotting down notes in thick logbooks. At the center, an officer oversaw the operation, quietly reviewing a large screen listing inmate statistics. A subordinate reported that the DOGMAN had achieved a set quota. Over half the pit's inhabitants were either killed or too traumatized to resist. The officer took notes, tapping a pen against a ledger labeled Phase 1 complete. Then he directed his staff to initiate the next stage of their plan. 30 miles north of the closest interstate, an abandoned mining town stands behind sagging wooden barriers and bent signposts. Years ago, hopeful workers arrived with drills and back-breaking determination, believing they would reap valuable metals from underground veins. Businesses sprang up around the robust operation, and families settled in small houses built along wide, dusty streets. A steady influx of equipment, provisions, and skilled labor turned the settlement into a modest hub of activity. Many thought they would spend their entire lives there. 15 years after the first successful extraction, the mine experienced a catastrophic cave-in that destroyed reinforced tunnels and trapped dozens of miners. Rescue teams struggled to breach the collapsed shafts. The final count of confirmed casualties grew each day. In the aftermath, a deep sinkhole appeared in the center of town. Locals called it the pit. cracks spread hundreds of yards beyond the initial collapse. Officials declared further excavation impossible. The once busy settlement emptied, leaving behind scattered debris and bleak memories. Geological teams studied the collapse zone, intrigued by unusual plants sprouting where the ground had split. These thick-stemmed specimens had distinct leaf structures loaded with potent enzymes. Laboratories confirmed that the extracted compounds contained potentially transformative medical properties. Pharmaceutical interests took note. Researchers considered the site a biological gold mine. Despite the town's demise, government agencies provided limited security to guard these newly discovered resources. Over time, scientists refined certain extracts into treatments, though unforeseen side effects complicated wider application. Local authorities, pressured by budget constraints, decided to repurpose the deserted cavity. They deemed the pit an ideal containment site for inmates considered unfit to rejoin society. Early prison transports showed little concern for human dignity. Guards forced convicts onto crude metal platforms and sometimes shoved them directly over the edge. Many suffered fatal impacts against protruding rock formations. Public outcry forced a shift to an enclosed wooden elevator, slowly lowering prisoners to the bottom. Politicians described this method as more civilized. Meanwhile, research on the newly identified plants intensified. Basic derivatives cured infections, but stronger formulas produced alarming changes in laboratory animals. Subjects grew larger, more aggressive, and developed heightened sensory capabilities. Over multiple experimental phases, scientists combined the plant-based compounds with genetic material from dogs and wolves, seeking a controlled enhancement of strength or disease resistance. Trials escalated from rodents to canines, and eventually to human subjects. Secret programs funneled certain experimental serums into the pit, using unwilling prisoners as test cases. The authorities did not publicize these tests. Several research sites struggled to handle violent outbursts by test subjects who displayed partial transformations. Some mutated individuals demonstrated canine features and predator instincts, attacking staff or each other. Government overseers decided the pit would serve as a remote laboratory where escaped subjects would remain contained behind the crater's high walls. If atrocities happened below ground, the public would never see them. Prisoners, already considered irredeemable, would be forgotten by society. In turn, scientists gained an endless supply of new test samples. Today, the pit stands as a grim symbol of neglect and clandestine ambition. Iron scaffolding clings to collapsed tunnel entrances. Inmates wander among debris piles, searching for anything to trade or consume. Many carry homemade weapons fashioned from rebar or broken tools. The entire area reeks of damp earth, sweat, and blood. Occasional howls resonate from the far tunnels, but no one rushes to investigate. The watchtowers above remain staffed by silent guards who lower fresh loads of prisoners each month. Few question where these men and women come from, or why some vanish without a trace. The pit continues operating as a hidden nexus of brutality and scientific manipulation, poised to receive more unwitting subjects in the name of progress. A battered truck rattles to a stop near the pit's rim, raising a billow of dust that settles on rows of barbed wire. Several guards in stained uniforms step forward, ignoring the heat radiating from scorching midday sun. They unlatch the metal tailgate, revealing a huddled mass of prisoners in worn jumpsuits. Every occupant appears exhausted or ill. Some cough uncontrollably. Others nurse bruises or limp from untreated injuries. A sergeant waves a clipboard in the air, indicating that everyone must disembark. The inmates shuffle off the truck, chains clinking around their ankles. One man stumbles and falls onto the dirt, scraping his hands. A guard laughs at him, calling him slow. Another inmate attempts to help him stand, but a guard intervenes with a rough shove. No official welcomes exist in this place. Beyond the guards, a chain-link fence borders the colossal drop. Wooden planks and steel beams brace the ragged edges of the crater. The occasional rock dislodges and tumbles down the slope. Most new arrivals stare into that dark void with dread. Two men exchange horrified glances and begin muttering in panicked tones about preferring death to whatever lies below. Their eyes dart toward the fence. Suddenly, those two break away from the line, slipping past a guard who moves too slowly to react. One leaps over the barrier, disappearing from sight. The second hesitates an instant, loses his footing, and plummets after the first. Screams reverberate for a second, then cease. The group of prisoners stands frozen, uncertain whether to interpret this as lunacy or liberation. A corporal smirks. He bets with a fellow guard on how many bones those men broke. The rest are herded onto a creaking wooden elevator that is little more than a platform suspended by thick cables. The operator in a tower signals readiness, and the contraption starts its descent. The entire structure shudders at the added weight. Several prisoners cling to the wooden rail, aware that a sudden malfunction would send them falling into the darkness. Guards remain behind at the rim, chuckling as the elevator sinks from sight. At the bottom, stale air and an overpowering stench greet the arrivals. Distant corners fade into shadow. Crumpled metal frames and sagging walls line the perimeter. Without warning, ragged figures rush toward the new group, clawing at shirts, pockets, and whatever items might hold value. A few inmates try to defend themselves, but they are hopelessly outnumbered. Robbery in the pit happens within moments of arrival, and no guards intervene. During this chaos, two novices scramble away, pressing themselves against a collapsed tunnel mouth. They tremble at the frantic scene, hearing curses and the sound of fists on flesh. One of them steps on a piece of broken glass, curses softly, and stifles a cry. The other tries to calm him. They glance around, searching for a safe route deeper into the warren of corridors. Night settles quickly in the pit, especially with limited lighting. The only illumination above is faint moonlight across the gaping hole. Some hours after the elevator landing, a pitiful moan echoes from the gloom. Nearby survivors realize it must be one of the men who jumped. The moan transforms into a series of strangled gasps. Some onlookers feel compelled to investigate, but fear keeps them back. A distorted silhouette staggers along the rubble-strewn ground. The figure's head tilts at an impossible angle, and its arms dangle. Cries turn into rasping sounds that resonate through the dead air. A guard at the rim, peering through a rifle scope, chuckles at the sight. He wonders how that inmate is still alive. Another guard believes the man will die within minutes. As the watchers argue, the figure below jerks upright, releasing a guttural exhalation. Then it lurches behind a fallen girder. At roughly the same time, several convicts claim to see another shape rising near the spot where the second jumper landed. A survivor swears the second man's skull was smashed open, yet that same body now stands, tottering from side to side and uttering painful groans. Many scatter, refusing to witness more. By daybreak, fragments of tattered clothing remain, but neither man's body is found. Michael no longer remembers the sunlight he once took for granted, nor the smell of fresh air. He navigates the labyrinth of broken corridors with practiced vigilance, always listening for footsteps or clinking metal. He stores modest supplies in hidden spots, hoping thieves never uncover them. He has survived multiple close calls, thanks in part to a partnership with a man named Dixon, who shares both desperation and a willingness to cooperate. Several weeks earlier, peculiar canine hybrids were introduced into the pit. Guards rolled caged containers to an old freight hatch and dropped them into lower tunnels. Rumblings and howls emanated from below. Soon, prisoners went missing. Survivors spoke of dog-like entities prowling in darkness. Dixon is a reserved individual who prefers action over talk. He greets Michael one morning with tense remarks about the fractured state of the pit. In the past, a few major gangs ruled resources, but the introduction of those dog-like monsters dismantled larger groups. Survivors splintered into smaller bands that roam aimlessly. Competition grows, with each faction seeking food, water, or anything that can be traded for advantage. Dixon believes more conflict looms. Michael acknowledges that violence escalates. Yesterday, 2 men were beaten severely for a single can of beans. The pit's supply drops arrive sporadically. Guards throw down crates containing questionable rations. Old water sacks arrive punctured. People fight over scraps. The tension intensifies with every new rumor about half-human beasts. Michael and Dixon discuss the possibility of fleeing deeper into the old mine shafts, hoping to find hidden pockets of water. They realize the risk, as those tunnels might house unimaginable threats. An older inmate mentions that the severely injured man from the recent jump has vanished. Some claim they saw him lurching away during the night, making guttural noises. Another rumor suggests that a second dead individual also disappeared, leaving behind bloody footprints. The pit's inhabitants quietly debate whether unholy transformations result from unscrupulous experiments. Michael tries to focus on tangible dangers, but he cannot dismiss these tales. Dixon likewise remains uncertain about the truth. During midday, Michael notices how restless everyone appears. A minor squabble over a piece of cloth escalates into a stabbing, leaving a scrawny inmate collapsed against a jagged stone. A cluster of onlookers shrugs and retreats, unwilling to get involved. Michael and Dixon avoid direct entanglements. They focus on preserving their limited food and a pair of battered flashlights that sometimes help them search dark corridors. As evening arrives, a fearful hush overtakes the settlement. Groups gather in tight circles, suspecting that the dog-like creatures may attack again. People whisper about vicious howling in the distance. Some older prisoners claim they have never heard such guttural tones before. Michael and Dixon remain near a collapsed passage where they built a makeshift shelter with scrap wood. They wait, alert to every distant sound. Shortly after dusk, an echoing shriek resonates through the canyon-like walls. It fades quickly, leaving no clear direction for search. A handful of desperate souls scurry into the deeper hollows, hoping to avoid detection by anything prowling outside. Dixon grips a metal pipe while Michael maintains watch. They hear sporadic scuffling and occasional moans. The night feels long, though only several hours pass. Before dawn, some convicts discover additional traces of blood near a collapsed stairwell. They also find marks in the dirt that suggest large paws dragging something heavy. Michael listens to the chatter. He has encountered no direct evidence of these creatures, yet the consistent stories prompt him to remain cautious. Dixon remarks that the pit resembles a slaughter pen more each day. When sunlight begins to illuminate the upper edges of the crater, the tension persists. Michael and Dixon venture out to scavenge, hoping to avoid roving gangs. Each turn in the corridor reveals new hazards: a half-buried body, shattered crates, or looming shapes that vanish around corners. The men speak little. Survival guides their actions. The pit's environment devolves steadily. They suspect an ultimate reckoning waits in the bowels of this forsaken hole, where savage beings roam without constraint. Michael and Dixon awaken in their makeshift hideout before dawn. They ration a small portion of water, each taking only a few sips. Their supplies are dwindling. Hunger gnaws at them, but they remain resolute. They prepare to search for anything salvageable in an area rumored to contain old storage rooms. Dixon packs a broken blade he fashioned from a section of steel pipe. Michael carries a short rod with a jagged edge. Moving along a cramped passage, they step over scattered debris. Broken beams protrude from the walls at odd angles. They advance quietly, checking every corner for potential ambushers. Faint torchlight flickers from deeper recesses. Occasionally, a scurrying rodent startles them, but they maintain discipline. The pit's labyrinth demands caution at every turn. Midway through their route, they spot a group of 7 malnourished prisoners huddled near a partially collapsed support column. These individuals appear restless, their eyes darting in search of easy prey. Their leader, a wiry man gripping a blood-stained club, stands at the forefront. He addresses Michael and Dixon in a brusque manner, demanding that they hand over any food or water. His tone implies no negotiation is possible. Michael and Dixon exchange a brief glance. They sense the hostility. When Dixon refuses to comply, 2 of the strangers move forward, attempting to corner him. Michael shifts position, gripping his rod. The tension erupts as the wiry leader swings his club at Dixon, who sidesteps and strikes back with his makeshift blade. Metal hits flesh. The attacker howls in pain. Chaos ensues. 4 more aggressors rush in. Michael knocks one aside with a forceful shove of the rod, striking the man's shoulder. Another tries to tackle Dixon from behind, but Dixon pivots and delivers a quick slash to the assailant's thigh. Shouts fill the corridor. The enclosed space amplifies every sound. One of the attackers stumbles over rubble and crashes to the ground. Another swings a jagged pipe at Michael's head, missing by inches. After a short, brutal skirmish, the group of 7 lies scattered. Several men clutch bleeding wounds. One tries to stand but collapses from exhaustion. Their leader, now sporting a deep gash across his forearm, glares at Michael and Dixon. He threatens revenge, but he lacks the strength to carry out the threat. Dixon breathes heavily, sweat drips from his face, and Michael's arms tremble from the adrenaline surge. Despite outnumbering them, the 7 had little stamina. Weeks of hunger have drained them. Michael and Dixon confiscate a half-empty water bottle that the gang carried. They also take a small portion of dried beans, though the quantity is negligible. They step away from the scene, unwilling to linger. None of the defeated men appear capable of immediate pursuit. Dixon warns that these individuals might attempt retaliation once they recover. Michael nods grimly, acknowledging that the pit spawns long-lasting grudges. Continuing down the corridor, they find a ransacked storage area. Wooden crates lie splintered, their contents looted long ago. Broken barrels and tangled ropes clutter the floor. A distant trickle suggests a possible water leak, but the source seems inaccessible behind collapsed stone. Michael inspects a section of collapsed ceiling, hoping to find anything edible. He only locates corroded scraps of metal that serve no clear purpose. Fatigue sets in. Dixon's arm bears a minor wound from the brawl, and Michael's shoulder aches from a blunt impact. They retreat to a dark alcove, mindful that another roving gang could appear. Dixon wraps a piece of cloth around his bleeding arm, grimacing at each movement. Michael stands guard, listening to echoes and scanning every approach. Their victory brought no comfort. Supplies remain scarce, and new threats emerge constantly. Nightfall approaches as they sneak back toward a safer portion of the pit. Occasional shrieks resonate from distant tunnels. Some might be the dog-like creatures. Others might be human. Nobody can distinguish them anymore. The lines between man and beast blur under the pit's oppressive conditions. Michael and Dixon remain silent, hoping to avoid further skirmishes. They intend to hide in a secure nook until morning. Survival requires that they evade confrontations that drain energy and risk fatal injuries. In the next few days, Michael and Dixon struggle to locate anything useful. They attempt to barter with fellow inmates who possess makeshift medicine or scraps of food, offering meager items like bent nails or a handful of beans. Resources around them are nearly depleted. The pit's confined world grows more perilous with every passing hour. Infections spread among the wounded, and chronic coughs echo in dim corridors. One afternoon, Michael proposes a visit to Wendell, a recluse who brews rudimentary remedies from mold and fungus. Wendell's hideout lies near a partially flooded shaft. His medical concoctions occasionally reduce fever or prevent cuts from festering, though he demands high payment. Dixon agrees that they should try. They pack 2 cans of expired vegetables as possible trade goods and depart their cramped refuge. Their path leads through a formerly active loading area, now littered with shattered crates. Ripped tarps flap from overhead wires. Dixon remarks on the unusual stillness. Michael surveys the surroundings, sensing an absence of the usual scavenger presence. They cross the open space carefully. A thick layer of dust coats everything. Broken glass crackles underfoot. An uneasy calm hangs in the stagnant air. Without warning, shadowy figures emerge from behind a crumpled piece of machinery. These strangers wear mismatched attire, but they carry well-maintained weapons, including metal batons enhanced with nails or sharpened edges. Their faces remain obscured by strips of cloth or improvised masks. They form a perimeter, cutting off Michael's and Dixon's escape. One steps forward, brandishing a baton that appears to be military surplus. His stance is steady. He does not resemble a starving vagrant. Michael senses a dangerous coordination. He attempts to question them, but they rush forward. Dixon parries the first swing, only to be struck on the side by a second assailant. Michael tries to intervene with his rod, but a powerful blow knocks him backward, nearly winding him. The attackers function with organized efficiency, unlike the ragged bandits typical of the pit. Their leader directs quick hand signals. Every movement appears practiced. Michael watches in horror as one masked man plunges a syringe into Dixon's arm, while 2 others hold him down. Dixon convulses, struggling to breathe. Michael lunges to help, but a baton slams into his ribs. He crashes against a broken crate, sending splinters flying. He tries to crawl to Dixon, yet another strike glances off his head, leaving him dazed. A nauseating chemical odor drifts through the air. In that disoriented state, Michael sees 2 attackers dragging Dixon away. His friend twitches and utters faint groans. The group's leader urges speed. Michael tries to stand but receives a savage kick to his shoulder. He falls again, gasping. The masked men say little aside from short commands to each other. Their objective seems specific: capture Dixon. A portion of Michael's mind registers that they have come prepared for this. When a brief commotion distracts the pair holding Michael, he musters the last of his strength. He twists free, kicking one man's leg, and scrambles to his feet. He glances around for Dixon, but Dixon is already being pulled toward a hidden passage behind a collapsed pillar. 2 armed figures guard that opening. Michael knows he cannot fight them alone in his battered condition. He staggers down a side corridor, ignoring the flashes of pain radiating from his ribs. Footfalls echo behind him. Metal clangs against concrete. He sprints along narrow tunnels where the ceiling sags, dodging broken beams and stepping across jagged rocks. The pursuit intensifies, then fades as Michael navigates a twisting path that he memorized during previous explorations. An old ventilation duct leads him into an isolated section of the pit. Eventually, he hears no further sounds of chasing footsteps. With lungs burning and sweat soaking his grimy clothes, Michael collapses in a dark alcove. He blocks the entrance with loose rubble and a rusted doorframe, creating a makeshift barricade. His entire body trembles from shock, and his vision blurs. He realizes Dixon is gone, taken by an organized group whose motives are unknown. Guilt pierces him. He curses his own powerlessness. He sits in silence, formulating a plan to survive and search for Dixon. Trust feels more precious than ever, yet he has lost the only true ally he had. Days have passed since he lost Dixon, and his hopes for assistance fade. During that interval, a series of unexplained disappearances shook the pit. Prisoners of all types simply vanished from their usual corridors. Some re-emerged after several days in a disoriented state, muttering incoherently and stumbling around as if their strength had been drained. Others never resurfaced at all. Rumors proliferate faster than anyone can disprove them. Certain inmates whisper that the abducted are dragged into hidden chambers by dog-like figures, while others insist it must be a new experiment involving tranquilizing chemicals. Sensing that chaos is intensifying, Michael seeks shelter among a small group that has coalesced under the leadership of a gaunt man named Hayes. This group defends a sheltered pocket where old mining equipment is stacked, creating a defensive barrier. Several watch posts are set up at key choke points. Despite minimal resources, these inmates have organized nighttime watches and attempt to keep track of who enters or exits. The climate of paranoia forces them to accept almost anyone willing to fight. Michael offers manual labor and some knowledge of hidden tunnels, so they let him stay under close observation. Before long, talk spreads about strangers returning with pale skin and hollow eyes. One woman in Hayes's group claims she saw a friend reappear near a collapsed corridor, moaning in a flat tone. That friend could not recall any details about where she had been. Her arms bore faint punctures, as if needles had been inserted. She shook uncontrollably whenever questioned. Later that night, she wandered away again without a word. Hayes mobilizes a patrol to chase after her, but they find only a torn scrap of fabric on the ground. The group's morale plummets. Each new day increases tension, partly because the DOGMAN's presence grows bolder. Scattered remains have been discovered at various corners of the pit. Some show tooth marks consistent with large jaws. Michael witnesses desperation in every face. No one trusts the next person entirely. Alliances form solely for protection. A different cluster of prisoners merges with Hayes's group, bolstering the defensive perimeter. Despite that, more vanishings occur, often in daylight. Guards at the rim do nothing to intervene. Michael understands that staying in one place might lead to the same fate as those who vanished. At first he considers persuading Hayes to gather a larger force and push deeper, but the DOGMAN's raids make that option risky. Patrols that venture too far from the group's center frequently lose members to sudden attacks. Some victims reappear as battered shells of themselves, while others remain missing. Michael cannot escape thoughts of Dixon. He wonders if his friend might still be alive, even though many claim that once you are taken by an organized faction, death or worse is certain. Michael struggles with guilt whenever he rests. He imagines Dixon trapped in some hidden chamber, forcibly subjected to the same horrors that produced the mindless captives. That fear compels Michael to stop passively waiting. During a dusk gathering, Hayes calls for volunteers to form a wider reconnaissance team. He wants to identify any pattern behind the disappearances. Few step forward. Most prefer to remain inside the ring of scavenged barricades. Michael volunteers because he sees no other path. Surviving day after day in that anxious environment yields no progress. He hopes the search might uncover evidence about Dixon or the DOGMAN. That night, Michael and 4 others embark on a cautious patrol. They skirt areas known to be DOGMAN territory and check derelict storage rooms. They find scattered footprints, smeared blood, and metal fragments resembling syringe caps. One companion grows nauseous after spotting a half-hidden body with glazed eyes and bite marks along the torso. The group retreats to safety, bringing back the few disturbing items they collected. Morale collapses further when 2 of Hayes's watchmen disappear the following evening. People start believing that nothing will stop the abductions or the bestial raids. Frustration leads to scuffles over meager rations. Hayes's group nearly splits from within. Michael realizes that staying in a large camp offers no true security if the dogmen or unidentified assailants strike at will. Driven by instinct, Michael decides to withdraw from the group entirely. He plans to slip away and return to the deserted hideout he once shared with Dixon, hoping to locate old caches and wait for an opportunity. He does not announce his intention. Michael travels alone through corridors that echo with distant shrieks. The air smells of rot and stale water. He clutches a crudely sharpened rod as he steps over rubble. He navigates by memory, recalling half-familiar passages that branch near the pit's southern edge. He hopes to reach the cramped spot where he once stored a small quantity of canned goods. At nightfall, he rests behind a collapsed support beam. He hears muffled howls rising from the far tunnels. He senses that multiple creatures move in unison, possibly coordinating a hunt. This is different from scattered sightings in the past. Their cries carry a forced pattern that suggests they are sweeping through sections systematically. Michael feels the tension in his chest. He wonders if they smell his sweat. Before dawn, a thunderous commotion shakes the darkness. Michael creeps forward and sees flickering torches illuminating the perimeter of an entrenched camp. That settlement belongs to a coalition that formed when dogman raids grew worse. Michael spots silhouettes racing along the barricades, shouting warnings. Moments later, a surge of half-naked, monstrous figures slams into the defenders. Their movements are swift and their snarling roars overwhelm human voices. Michael watches from behind a jagged wall, horrified by how quickly the defenders crumble. The monstrous assailants strike with claws and fangs. They drag convicts away without mercy. Within minutes, the strong points collapse. Michael notices that the dogmen leave no corpses. They drag every victim into the gloom. Panicked cries echo across the corridors. Fires flicker out as lanterns topple. The chaos is brief, yet devastating. Then the shrieks subside, leaving a ghastly hush. Michael observes a wounded prisoner stumble away from the wreckage. That man's arm is covered in puncture wounds that bleed heavily. His eyes appear unfocused. He collapses not far from Michael's hiding place. When Michael approaches to offer assistance, the man's breathing sounds wet and labored. He cannot speak coherently. His gaze flickers between fear and fury. Michael attempts to bandage the arm using a scrap of cloth. A low growl issues from the man's throat as if something inside him rejects the help. Then his limbs begin jerking uncontrollably. Michael has no medical knowledge that can reverse an apparent transformation. He backs away, uncertain whether to flee or try to calm the man. The convulsions intensify. Bones shift under pale skin, producing sharp cracking sounds. The man's face contorts, and an animalistic rasp escapes his lungs. Michael cannot bear to watch further. He turns and runs, leaving the man to his fate. That confrontation confirms everything. The dogman's bite or claw wound triggers a horrific progression, turning victims into new predators. The infection spreads rapidly, and the pit has become a breeding ground. Haunted by this realization, Michael continues onward. He avoids direct conflict by concealing himself in side tunnels whenever he hears voices or sees movement. He eventually locates the collapsed corridor near his old hideout, but the entire area is littered with debris. While clearing a path, he notices footprints near an opening that leads deeper underground. They appear fresh, suggesting someone has been here recently. Cautious, he inches forward, forced to move debris with minimal noise. Pushing through a narrow gap, he enters the old chamber where he and Dixon once stashed goods. The shelves are intact, though mostly empty. A single can of vegetables remains. Dust covers every surface, and the stale odor indicates no one else has dwelled here. Just when he thinks the place is deserted, he spots a huddled figure lying near the wall. He raises his rod, prepared for an ambush. Then he sees that it is Dixon. Dixon is pale, trembling, and barely responsive. His clothes hang on him like rags. Michael's heart pounds as he kneels beside his friend. He gently touches Dixon's shoulder, unsure if the man is even conscious. Dixon's eyes flutter, revealing partial awareness. He mumbles about a metal door and a painful brightness. Michael cannot decipher the words fully, but he suspects that Dixon endured something far beyond a typical DOGMAN attack. Outside, scraping sounds echo against the walls. It could be dogmen sniffing for prey. It could be mutated captives searching for a meal. Michael remains silent, placing a hand over Dixon's mouth to keep him from groaning. Darkness surrounds them. They have no reliable light source, and the corridor resonates with ominous noises. Michael's relief at finding Dixon alive collides with a sense of dread. Whatever happened to him has left him frail and haunted, perhaps beyond repair. Michael watches over Dixon at dawn. His friend's breathing is shallow. His arms and legs twitch at random intervals. When Dixon finally opens his eyes, he seems disoriented, as if torn between memories and nightmares. Michael checks him for obvious wounds and finds no bite marks. However, small needle scars dot Dixon's arms and neck. Questions swirl. Michael tries speaking quietly. "Dixon, can you hear me? Where did they take you?" Dixon's gaze wanders and his speech is slurred. He mentions a metal door and a glaring light. He mutters about unfamiliar men wearing protective suits. Michael struggles to understand, but the words suggest a location beyond the usual tunnels. Dixon appears drained by the effort of talking. He collapses into a trembling sleep. By mid-morning, Michael hears scraping noises outside the chamber. He peeks through a gap in the rubble and sees 3 dogmen prowling the corridors. These creatures appear gaunt but powerful, with fur patches across their shoulders and arms. Their faces bear muzzle-like protrusions, and their eyes remain fixated on the darkness ahead. They move in a pack formation, sniffing at the dust. Michael realizes they may sense the presence of human survivors. He prepares to hide silently, but the dogmen approach the entrance. They utter guttural snarls that echo around the chamber. Dixon stirs and attempts to stand, but he is too weak. Michael braces himself for a desperate fight. The dogmen crouch, preparing to attack. Then Dixon utters a shuddering moan, clutching his abdomen. His entire frame spasms. Muscles bulge unnaturally. His back arches and he emits a roar that seems deeper than any normal human throat could produce. In front of Michael's eyes, Dixon's appearance shifts. Coarse hair sprouts along his arms, and his features contort into a wolf-like shape rather than a dog's. Unlike the other dogmen, Dixon grows a thicker layer of fur along his spine, and his posture remains more upright. One dogman lunges forward, but Dixon counters with brutal force, slamming the attacker aside. A second tries to clamp powerful jaws onto Dixon's shoulder, but Dixon twists free. Michael backs against the wall, afraid that Dixon's aggression might extend to any living presence. The ferocious transformation continues. Dixon's eyes burn with a savage intensity. The dogmen circle him, uncertain how to proceed. One of them charges. Dixon strikes with a clawed hand, tearing at the creature's torso. The dogman howls and falls back. The others growl, adjusting positions. For a moment, Dixon's attention shifts to Michael. He bares his teeth in a threatening posture, as if ready to pounce. Michael grips his makeshift rod, though he doubts he could repel this mutated form of his friend. Then Dixon freezes. He sniffs the air around Michael and exhales a low rumble. It is neither a friendly greeting nor an outright challenge. The dogmen appear to sense a stronger predator, and they encircle Dixon, as if trying to test him. Dixon's face twitches, then he lowers his stance and emits a guttural command. The dogmen hesitate. Michael cannot parse the meaning, but it seems to carry authority. Instead of resuming their assault, the dogmen begin pacing in a broad arc. Dixon keeps himself between Michael and the pack. He raises one clawed hand, tracing a rough outline in the dust on the ground. It looks like a rectangle with a smaller line beneath it. Then he scrawls the word, "Go." Michael realizes Dixon is granting him a chance to leave. He interprets it as a directive. Find a door, get out. The dogmen remain uneasy, but none attack Michael directly. Dixon utters a short, sharp growl, as if instructing them to stand down. Then he steps toward the corridor, beckoning Michael to follow. Michael, still trembling, inches behind Dixon. He notices that Dixon's mind has not been destroyed by the transformation. Something of his human awareness persists. Together, they exit the chamber. The dogmen close ranks, but do not tear Michael apart. They regard Dixon with something akin to respect or fear. Michael's mind reels with questions. Dixon's monstrous form towers over the standard dogmen, and his silver-flecked fur stands out against their dull coats. The group proceeds through the half-lit passageways, leaving behind the collapsed hideout. Michael feels stunned by the abrupt shift. Minutes ago, he expected to die in a hopeless confrontation. Now he follows a mutated ally who appears to command lesser beasts. Dixon leads Michael through corridors that slope downward, then twist upward again, forming a complex network of forgotten shafts. The ragged dogmen follow several yards behind, seeming reluctant to challenge Dixon's dominance. Michael keeps quiet, observing how Dixon navigates passages he should not logically know. They pass rusted gates, partial cave-ins, and shafts that appear long abandoned. Occasionally, Dixon pauses to check the air, sniffing for danger. More than once, they encounter stray dogmen prowling intersections. Those creatures step aside, letting Dixon and Michael pass without incident. Michael wonders whether they sense the presence of a stronger predator. The journey feels surreal. He and a mutated friend, accompanied by feral beasts, roam labyrinthine depths once excavated by miners. No guards, no human gangs, only the quiet drip of water and the distant scuttling of rodents. After covering at least half a mile, they reach a dead-end wall. Dixon places his clawed hands on the cracked surface and scrapes away layers of loose mortar. A portion of the stone collapses, revealing heavy metal doors behind it. Rust mottles the hinges, but the doors remain sealed. Dixon drives his shoulder against the seam, causing the frame to groan. He repeats the motion until the corroded lock breaks. The doors swing inward, revealing an ancient stairwell that spirals upward. Michael steps forward cautiously. He shines his weak flashlight on the steps, noticing dust and footprints. He wonders who last traveled this route. Dixon gestures for him to ascend, and the dogmen linger at the threshold, unwilling to climb higher. Michael suspects they dislike leaving the pit's depths. Dixon, however, does not hesitate. He starts up the steps, still in his mutated form. The spiral path is cramped and winding. They climb for many minutes, occasionally stopping to rest. Dixon's breathing is ragged, and Michael notices dark scratches on Dixon's arms, likely from the earlier fight. Fresh blood seeps through the matted fur. Michael says little, uncertain whether Dixon fully comprehends human language at this point. Dixon stares back with a mixture of determination and pain. Near the top, they emerge into a large, dimly lit chamber. Broken machinery lines one wall, and a collapsed segment of ceiling lets in faint light from above. Two massive figures guard an open space near a heavy grate. Their forms are larger than the standard dogman. They stand upright, at least 7 feet tall, with powerful limbs and thick necks. Michael recognizes them instantly. Weeks ago, he watched guards push massive iron crates over the edge and heard the crash as these monsters landed in the depths. Later, he and Dixon narrowly survived a brutal encounter when these very brutes roamed the tunnels and attacked without mercy. The pair emits low growls, stepping forward aggressively. Dixon roars back, but his injuries hamper him. One of the hulks lunges, slamming Dixon into a concrete pillar with incredible force. Michael tries to intervene with his metal rod, but the second giant swipes him aside. Michael tumbles across the floor, feeling pain in his ribs. Dixon recovers enough to tackle the first creature, and they crash together against a pile of scrap. Claws and teeth tear at thick hide. Dixon's fury is evident, but he is smaller than these older beasts. The second monster charges again, forcing Michael to roll behind a rusted gearbox for cover. He rises unsteadily. The creature lurches forward, but Michael jabs the rod at its flank, causing it to flinch momentarily. In that brief interval, Dixon delivers a punishing blow to the first giant's head, slamming it into the concrete. Bones crack. The wounded giant collapses, but the second tries to clamp its jaws around Dixon's arm. Dixon howls, writhing in pain as teeth grind against flesh. Michael strikes the giant's back with all his strength. Although the blow barely pierces thick fur, it distracts the creature enough for Dixon to twist free. Dixon seizes the giant by the throat, employing an immense surge of power. They stagger toward the edge of the chamber, where a gaping drop leads back into the pit. Dixon strains every muscle, lifting the gargantuan foe off the ground. The giant flails, but Dixon drives him over the ledge. Both giant dogmen plunge downward. One lands with a horrifying crash far below. The other tries to cling to a ledge, but loses its grip and disappears into the darkness. Dixon collapses to one knee, blood seeping from deep wounds. Michael rushes to his side, supporting him. Together they limp toward a short flight of steps leading past the heavy grate. A battered door stands open, revealing a corridor that leads to the surface. No guards remain at this hidden exit. Michael and Dixon step through, emerging into open air for the first time in an age. Gray sunlight washes over them. Behind them, the pit's open maw extends downward like a chasm of misery. Freedom beckons, yet Dixon struggles to stand, trembling under the weight of his injuries. Cool air greets them as they emerge onto the deserted rim. Chain-link fencing sags beside a rusted guard post, and no one mans the observation towers. Dixon leans heavily on Michael, each labored step an ordeal. His fur remains bristled, and his breathing is ragged. They reach a concrete barrier where remnants of barbed wire lie tangled in heaps. Beyond it lies open land dotted with scraggly weeds and scattered boulders. The horizon stretches for miles under a pale sky. Dixon lowers himself onto a broken slab, gazing at the distance as though recognizing that a normal life is no longer possible. He emits a strained whine, unlike any human sound. Michael tries to help him stand again, but Dixon pulls away, his gaze full of sorrow. For a moment they lock eyes. Michael senses that Dixon is choosing a path of self-imposed exile rather than further existence in that hybrid form. Before Michael can speak, Dixon staggers back toward the edge, looking down into the pit's unfathomable drop. A faint wind rustles the debris. Michael shouts, "Wait, don't do this." He lunges forward, trying to grab Dixon's arm, but Dixon jerks free. With a final mournful glance, Dixon leaps into the void. Michael rushes to the brink and peers downward, screaming his friend's name, but no response rises from the depths. The only sound is the dull rush of air against the crater walls. Michael collapses to his knees, tears burning his eyes. He has escaped the pit, yet the cost has been staggering. He feels unmoored, uncertain where to go next. The surrounding region is deserted, with no sign of government patrols or local inhabitants. His sorrow at losing Dixon overshadows any relief about standing in open air. After several minutes, he musters the will to move. He limps away from the pit, scanning the area for a road or a landmark. Meanwhile, at an undisclosed facility, a row of monitors displays high-resolution camera feeds from multiple angles inside the pit. Military personnel in fatigues stand at attention while scientists in pristine lab coats review the recordings. One screen shows Dixon's final leap, captured by a camera mounted near the old guard station. Another screen replays the clash with the giant dogmen. The lead scientist strokes his chin, evidently impressed by the raw data. He addresses a subordinate. Phase 2 has generated more conversions than we projected. The dogman population has increased, and the modified wolf strain achieved higher cognitive retention. The subject designated Dixon demonstrated the ability to preserve partial memory, plus advanced motor skills. He also displayed unique territorial dominance over standard dogmen. We must locate him, even if his current status is uncertain. A uniformed officer queries the viability of retrieving Dixon from the crater. The scientist shakes his head. We suspect he survived the fall, given the regenerative characteristics observed in the wolf strain. Also, he may wander the tunnels or escape through alternate routes. We need to track him discreetly. Instruct the perimeter squads to avoid harming him. Our interest is purely research-oriented at this stage. We have not completed analyzing his blood panels. Another scientist glances at a screen featuring Michael in partial silhouette, moving across the pit's boundary. She remarks, "That man accompanied Dixon. Their bond might be valuable." We can observe how emotional ties influence hybrid behavior. The lead scientist nods, insisting that Michael be monitored. He is not a primary target, but we cannot let him disappear. If Dixon resurfaces and seeks him out, we must be prepared. The overhead lights flicker in the facility's control room, revealing charts of infection rates, genetic breakdowns, and estimated population changes. Subordinates take notes, planning the next phase of field testing. Quiet agreement prevails. The experiments will continue. The pit, though terrifying, remains an isolated environment for unrestrained trials. No major oversight threatens to intervene. The government has little incentive to shut down what it considers a contained program. Back at the crater's rim, Michael wanders along a narrow gravel path, grieving and numb. He contemplates heading north, uncertain whether to risk official highways or remain in backcountry terrain. With each step, he remembers Dixon's final expression. That memory hurts more than any physical wound. A single question propels him forward. How can he expose the truth behind the pit, and who would even believe him?
Story 2.
I have been living in this wooden house deep in the heart of Maine for almost 3 decades, ever since I fully retired. The house is modest, with weathered walls, a roof faded by time, and a woodpile by the door that's always stocked. I used to be a doctor, quite a good one if my patients are to be believed. But that feels like a lifetime ago. Now my hands tremble and my eyesight fails me, though I like to think my mind remains sharp. Sometimes I wonder why fate decided I should outlive so many of my loved ones and patients. Perhaps it was so I could carry memories of things I dare not share, lest I be thought mad. I am over 80 now, and it has been exactly 6 decades since I encountered a story that still chills my spine on sleepless nights. They say time heals all wounds, but I feel no relief. Instead, I carry a thorn deep in my soul that refuses to let me rest. On certain evenings, when the wind whistles past the walls and it seems as though distant howls echo through the night, I startle and clutch my chest. In those moments, the memory of what I saw in a small, nearly abandoned settlement comes rushing back. The residents of that place were afflicted by a mysterious illness, and I was called to help. How they found me and why they turned to me specifically remains tied to a story that once connected me deeply to a man I considered a friend, though I haven't heard from him in many years. I received the letter when I was in my early 20s. I had just graduated from medical school and begun my practice in a small town somewhere in the eastern United States. Life seemed simple and straightforward. Wake up, go to the clinic, help patients, and return home to my wife, may she rest in peace, and our young son. But one cold January morning, I found a letter in my mailbox that changed everything. The sender's name was almost illegible, worn away by time and travel. But when I finally deciphered it, my heart sank. It was from Joseph Blackthorne, a man I hadn't seen in years but who had once come perilously close to dying before my very eyes. I had saved his life, pulled him back from the brink, but after that, our paths diverged, and we never crossed paths again. The letter was brief but unsettling. Joseph wrote that he was in a remote settlement whose name meant nothing to me. He begged me to come as quickly as possible. He spoke of a strange illness afflicting the locals, of fevers and nightmares, of despair and fear that things could end very badly. The letter's rushed handwriting carried an urgency that was hard to ignore, with phrases like, "Only you can figure this out. I trust no one else. Forgive me for asking this of you." His words were oddly specific. How could Joseph be so certain that I would understand the nature of the illness? At the time, I attributed it to our past bond and his trust in me as a doctor. 2 emotions warred within me: fear of the unknown and a sense of professional pride. As a doctor, I knew I had a duty to help anyone in need, but something about the letter frightened me. It came from an isolated corner of the United States, a place neither I nor any of my colleagues had ever heard of. How could there even be civilization out there, I wondered, and how do they survive without regular medical care? But most troubling of all was the absolute urgency in Joseph's plea. He even wrote, "Forgive me for the lack of details. There are things here too dangerous to put on paper." I remember how long I hesitated. It was winter, and travel in those days was nothing like it is now. Narrow, snow-covered roads, rickety wooden bridges, trains that didn't reach everywhere, and mountains that were nearly impossible to access. My family was also less than thrilled. My wife cried and begged me to stay, especially since I had just been offered a position at a reputable hospital where I could advance quickly. And then there was my young son. Leaving him, even for a few days, felt like agony. But every time I considered refusing, an image of Joseph would come to mind. The man whose heart I had once restarted with my own hands in a makeshift field hospital. I couldn't turn my back on his plea. After a few days of inner turmoil, I made my decision. I packed the essentials into my medical bag. Morphine, quinine, alcohol, bandages. I added a set of tools, an old stethoscope, syringes, glass ampoules. Then I included warm clothes, high boots, and a sturdy coat. The day I left was bitterly cold. The sky was clear, but the air was so frigid that my breath formed clouds instantly. I bid farewell to my wife and son, promising to return as soon as possible. The journey was long and exhausting. First, I boarded a train heading north, its wheels clattering over old tracks. The ride lasted all night, and by morning, a full-blown blizzard had enveloped us, making the warmth of the train feel like the only haven in the world. At the station where I arrived, a spring carriage, a rickety old buggy pulled by 2 horses, was waiting for me. The driver, apparently hired at Joseph's request, was a middle-aged man with a warm scarf covering half his face. He silently helped with my luggage and introduced himself briefly. "You can call me Ben." He spoke little, but his cautious gaze suggested that he wasn't just guiding me, but also concealing where we were headed. The ride in the buggy took several more hours. We traveled along snow-covered country roads that wound through barren trees. Gradually, the path narrowed, and the snow grew deep enough to reach the horses' knees in places. I felt the cold seep under my coat despite all my layers. Ben occasionally glanced at me with sympathy, but offered no comfort. There was nothing to be done but endure the merciless weather, clenching my teeth and hoping we'd soon arrive. At one point, I noticed the forest around us becoming denser and darker. The tree branches intertwined, forming a kind of tunnel through which we crept, listening to the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves. I thought to myself, if something goes wrong here, we'll have no choice but to spend the night in this wilderness. The only reassuring factor was that Ben seemed to know the way. Finally, after a few more hours, we stopped at a small roadside cabin where we swapped the buggy for something resembling a truck, an old battered vehicle adapted for these rugged conditions. The horses were exhausted, as were we, so I was relieved to move into a less exposed, if not much warmer, form of transport. The passenger door didn't shut properly, but at least I was no longer sitting out in the open. We continued on, winding through narrow paths that felt more like deer trails. Hills covered in pine trees surrounded us, and here and there rocky outcrops jutted out, resembling frozen creatures. It felt as though nature itself resisted our intrusion into this land. As we approached the final stretch of the journey, the truck could go no farther. The road had become too narrow and frozen. I had no choice but to continue on foot. With a sigh, Ben grabbed a lantern and walked beside me, carrying part of my luggage. "Not much farther now, Doctor," he said, and we trudged on, carving a path through the snow. I heard the faint whispers of the wind and occasionally the crunch of branches underfoot. At times I thought I saw shapes flitting in the shadows of the forest, but perhaps it was only the lantern light playing tricks on my eyes. Each minute dragged on like an hour, and just as I began to doubt we'd reach anywhere at all, the first buildings appeared through the trees. The settlement was small, no more than a dozen or two houses scattered unevenly along the forest's edge. In the twilight, they looked like frozen ghosts waiting in silence. Some windows glowed with warm yellow light, and smoke curled from chimneys. A strange mix of relief and unease washed over me. I had finally arrived. But what awaited me in this isolated place? Hearing our footsteps, a few people emerged onto the porches of their homes. They were bundled in warm clothing. One had a blanket wrapped around them, while another held a poker as if it were a weapon. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and apprehension. However, when they saw me, a clear outsider carrying what looked like a medical bag, they exchanged glances, and I caught a flicker of hope in their eyes. "The doctor is here," a soft voice called out, and the news seemed to ripple through the settlement. More residents stepped out of their homes. A woman in her 40s offered me hot tea from a thermos, and an older man helped carry my bag of medical supplies. Their warm reception surprised me. In remote places like this, strangers are usually met with suspicion, yet here I was greeted with gratitude and even relief. Eventually, I was led to a house near the center of the settlement. It was the largest one, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch and a sturdy door adorned with an iron handle. I realized this must be the home of the community's leader. In small settlements, the most important affairs are often centered there. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s greeted me at the door. He had a determined look and graying temples. He wore a simple but clean shirt and a warm sheepskin cloak. His handshake was firm as he introduced himself as Marshal Douglas. His voice was calm but resolute, carrying the authority of someone his people trusted. "Thank you for coming, Doctor," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "We were told you were on your way." "I apologize for the inconvenience. Our settlement is far from civilization and we rarely have visitors. But I'm glad you're here. People began falling ill a couple of weeks ago, and things are getting worse." He gestured for me to come inside. The spacious living room smelled of warm bread and burning logs. A few people were already seated there, some holding mugs of herbal tea, others looking pale and worn out. Marshall offered me a chair and, once I was seated, continued to explain. "It's a strange illness," he said. "It starts with mild itching, then weakness, fever, some have bad dreams, wake up screaming, and there are others with almost no symptoms, but they speak of unexplained anxiety. We don't know what this is, which is why we sent for you. No one knows how to treat it." I listened intently, nodding, mentally compiling a list of potential causes. New infections, fungi, parasites, the possibilities were endless. But without examinations, it was all speculation. It was clear that Marshall was deeply concerned for his people. His hands fidgeted with a crumpled note, likely a list of the sick or their symptoms. I made a mental note of his demeanor. He's trying to appear composed, but inside he's consumed by fear. Knowing how epidemics work, I understood that if this illness was contagious, time was critical, especially in a remote, snowbound place like this, far from any modern hospital. "I'm ready to begin examinations," I said at last. "We'd be most grateful, Doctor," Marshall replied. "Any help you can offer is invaluable." Thus began my first encounter with the settlement, a place I was about to delve into far deeper than I could have imagined. And yet, throughout it all, one question lingered in my mind. Where is Joseph Blackthorne, and why didn't he meet me himself? The next morning, I woke up early. The night had been restless. Outside, the wind howled, and inside, my thoughts churned with unease. I still hadn't seen Joseph, and no one had mentioned him. It was as if he had vanished into this snowy wilderness, leaving behind only his letter. The villagers knew a doctor was coming, but none seemed aware of who had summoned me. It was as though Joseph had dissolved into the cold, white expanse. I packed my medical bag and stepped outside. The weather had shifted. The wind had calmed, and the snow had stopped, but the bitter cold remained, each breath burning my throat. Marshall, the settlement's leader, was already waiting for me nearby. "Doctor," he said, "I'll take you to the first patients. We've set up a small cabin as a makeshift infirmary for those who can no longer move around on their own." We walked along a narrow lane flanked by low wooden houses. The silence was broken only by the crunch of our footsteps in the snow and the occasional crackle of smoke from chimneys. Villagers nodded respectfully as we passed, some with hope in their eyes, others with fear. The infirmary was a small, single-room building with a solitary stove in the corner. Inside, several patients lay on makeshift cots, mostly elderly people and teenagers. I moved from one to the next, checking pulses, examining throats and eyes, and asking routine questions. "When did the itching start? Do you feel joint pain? How are you sleeping? What do you eat?" Their answers were strikingly similar. The itching had started around the same time for everyone, disrupting sleep and bringing strange, vivid dreams. Most of them reported weakness and occasional fever, but none of the cases appeared life-threatening. It all seemed like a mild infection or an allergic reaction, yet the sheer number of cases in such a small village alarmed me. I took temperatures. Some were slightly elevated, others near normal. The rashes, which sometimes turned into blisters, didn't match any dermatological patterns I recognized. They ranged from pale pink to nearly colorless, appearing in random places on each patient. I jotted down my observations, trying to make sense of it all. Could it be the water supply? Perhaps they were drinking contaminated water from a nearby stream. Or maybe their food, stored for long periods in cellars, had been tainted with mold or fungi. But for now, these were just hypotheses. When I returned to Marshall's house, I found about 20 villagers waiting, each with complaints. Some brought children with fevers. Most reported the same symptoms: itching, fatigue, nightmares, and low-grade fevers. I distributed ointments I'd brought along and made an herbal tincture to ease anxiety and help with sleep. The villagers accepted the remedies gratefully, their relief palpable. Yet I could see the weight of their expectations. They wanted to believe a doctor's arrival would solve everything, but I had no guarantees to offer, not yet understanding the root of their ailment. When the stream of patients subsided, I was left alone with Marshall in his living room. He looked at me, awaiting some kind of verdict. I sighed. "This resembles something viral or parasitic," I said. "But typically, with an outbreak of this scale, symptoms would be more severe. For now, I don't see anything critical, but the scale of the illness is concerning." Marshall nodded, his face grim. "What do we do, doctor?" I suggested implementing basic hygiene measures, boiling drinking water, airing out homes frequently, and monitoring the sick closely. I also resolved to continue examining patients to gather more information. The rest of the day was spent visiting homes. In one, I met a middle-aged man plagued by recurring nightmares, visions of animal faces, shadowy forests, and glowing eyes in the darkness. He had no fever, and his skin showed only faint redness on his wrists. In another home, I spoke with an elderly woman whose small scratch refused to heal. She insisted the wound had appeared spontaneously in the night. Listening to these accounts, I began to suspect the illness might not be purely physical but psychological as well. Could stress be the culprit? But how could an entire settlement simultaneously fall into such a state of distress? By evening, I returned to Marshall with a proposal. We should create a survey for the villagers to document their diets, work routines, and any contact with wild animals. I hoped to find a pattern. However, collecting such information here would be challenging. Many villagers were illiterate, and those who could write were hesitant. Still, we agreed to try the following day. Before bed, I asked again about Joseph, trying to piece together where he might have gone. "We don't have a permanent resident by that name," Marshall replied. "We do get travelers passing through, though. Maybe he's already left." The comment struck me as odd. Could Joseph really have left without waiting for me? Or was he hiding? Or perhaps the villagers weren't telling me everything. I decided not to press further, focusing instead on unraveling the mystery of the strange illness. That night I slept in a room on the second floor of Marshall's house. The lamp flickered and the floorboards creaked in the corner. I struggled with insomnia, and when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of distorted faces, their hands morphing into claws and glowing eyes peering from the darkness. I woke drenched in cold sweat, my thoughts scattered. Perhaps I'm absorbing the villagers' fear, I thought. But the next morning, as I stared at the dark circles under my eyes in the mirror, I felt an unsettling realization creeping in. I, too, was beginning to catch their anxiety. I spent the entire first half of the next day examining the area around the settlement. The idea was simple. If there was reason to suspect that the source of the disease was hidden in the water, soil, or flora, we needed to check the nearby forests, river, if there was one, or lake. I was accompanied by a young man named Tommy. He volunteered to help after I mentioned that I needed a guide. Tommy looked healthier than the others, probably because he had almost no symptoms except for occasional nightmares. "Honestly, I'm scared too," he admitted, "but sitting idle is even scarier." We followed a narrow trail that led to the lake, about which I had learned from Marshall. There were still deep snowdrifts all around, and the sunlight reflecting off the whiteness of the snow was dazzling. The forest opened up on the sides, and soon we reached a clearing with a view of the frozen water surface. Heavy pine trees leaned over the shore like giant guards. I took some sample jars from my bag and asked Tommy to help break the ice to collect a water sample. After rummaging through my tools, I found a small axe, and soon we managed to carve out a hole. The water was surprisingly clear and odorless. I carefully filled several glass tubes and sealed them with tight rubber stoppers. I planned to later check for any sediment or impurities. Then we walked around the lake's perimeter and didn't notice anything suspicious. No dead fish, no driftwood, no signs of chemical discharge, which one might expect living closer to a town. In these parts, nature seemed untouched. I wrote a few notes in my notebook, noting that the lake was likely not the source of the trouble, but still left a reminder for myself. Check in more detail if possible. We continued along the forest edge. I examined the trees for fungal growths or strange mosses that could indicate some anomalous processes in the ecosystem. But aside from the usual lichens, nothing eerie was found. Tommy mentioned that in autumn there were many berries and mushrooms here. The residents were satisfied with the harvest, and no one complained about food poisoning. I noted again. If it's a parasite, it might come from animal meat, not plants. But in conversation, Tommy didn't seem to mention any mass hunting. As we walked, I kept feeling like I sensed someone's presence in the distance. It was as if shadows were sliding between the trees, but every time I turned my head, there was only a branch swaying in the wind. When I told Tommy about this, he whispered, "A lot of people here have that feeling right now, like someone is watching from behind the trees." We both fell silent, feeling uneasy. Suddenly, the crack of a branch echoed from deep within the forest, and we froze alertly. A man emerged from behind the trees, whom I first recognized as a hunter. He carried a rifle on his shoulder. Tall, bearded, in sturdy, warm clothes. Seeing us, the stranger slightly lowered his weapon and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I went out for small game." Tommy immediately sighed with relief and smiled at the hunter, calling him Mr. Flynn. I introduced myself and said that I was a doctor who had come to their settlement to help with the disease. The hunter didn't look too surprised. "Heard we have a doctor now," he said. "My wife was complaining of itching. I told her it was nothing. It would pass on its own, but I'm not so sure about that now." I noticed that his own hands, especially his palms, had some red spots. "Yeah, this crap appeared on me too," Flynn admitted. "I don't even know where it came from, but it's damn itchy." I asked him to show his palms. There were small blisters, like from nettles, but paler. When I suggested applying ointment, he waved his hand, saying he was used to such minor things. However, the slight worry in his eyes revealed that he wasn't completely indifferent to the symptoms. I inquired about the hunter's diet, what he ate, whether he had encountered any wild animals that were sick or injured. Flynn frowned, as if remembering something unpleasant. "How could I not encounter, Doctor? We all live in the forest here. Last month we managed to shoot a strange beast. No one really understood what kind of creature it was. It looked like a wolf, but not a wolf, like a badger, but larger. Its fur was coarse, black-gray. I didn't want to shoot it myself, but the beast charged first, barely fought it off." Flynn shrugged, trying to show that there was nothing special about it, but I detected a note of concern in his voice. "We ate that beast later. It was just a local holiday, a festival. We roasted it over the fire. No one got sick then, and the meat tasted normal. Could this have been the cause?" My heart tightened. An unidentified beast, consumed by the entire village, significantly increased the risk of infection transmission. "How long ago did this happen?" I asked. "At the beginning of winter, Doctor, about a month and a half ago," Flynn replied. The puzzle was starting to come together. The timeline could indeed coincide with the onset of the first symptoms. I suspected that the beast could have had parasites or viruses unknown to medicine. After thanking Flynn, Tommy and I talked with him a bit more about hunting, but didn't uncover anything supernatural. The hunter shook my hand in farewell and went back into the forest, waving his rifle at us. I pondered, perhaps this wild beast is the key to the mystery. What if it was something like a mutated wolf, a carrier of a rare disease, or worse, an entirely unknown creature? Returning to the settlement, I immediately went to Marshall to share my suspicions. He confirmed that yes, they had a festival where they ate an unusual beast they nicknamed Black Fur. Some residents said the meat tasted good, slightly sweet. But back then, no one even thought about the potential danger. I asked to find out if they still had any remains of the bones or hides to take samples for analysis. Marshall shrugged. "Maybe some remains are left. We need to ask people. Although some of the remains were thrown somewhere in the forest." Thus, I first directly encountered the thought that this disease could be related to eating something improper, alien to human nature. And because of that, it seemed even more dangerous. For if it was a mutated parasite, who knows what forms it could take? In the evening, as I tried to sleep, fragments of images appeared before my eyes again. The yawning mouth of the beast, bloody meat on skewers, the hunter looking into the black eyes of an unknown predator. Perhaps this would be the key to the mystery, although I didn't even want to imagine what such a discovery could lead to. The next morning, I asked Marshall to introduce me to the person who was the main organizer of the festival where that very meat was served. It turned out to be a man named Harry Winston, a local enthusiast who organized a winter celebration for the entire village every year. Axe-throwing competitions, songs, and dances around the bonfire. The festival always lifted people's spirits before the harsh frosts. Marshall explained. But this time, in addition to the usual food, there was this strange trophy brought by Hunter Flynn. I met Harry at his home. He was a short man around 45 with friendly wrinkles around his eyes, but a look that conveyed worry. He invited me to sit by the fireplace, and as we settled in, he began to talk about the festival without hiding his bitterness. "We always celebrated the beginning of winter and the end of the hunting season," he said. "But this time Flynn brought game that no one could identify. The hide was black, the fur was coarse, and the beast's eyes were cloudy, but that was after death. Some said it could have been a wolf or a coyote hybrid. But the meat tasted good, though unusual. We decided, since he had already shot the beast, why throw it away, so we cooked it over the fire." I asked, were there any alarming signs with the beast during the butchering? Maybe a strange smell or the color of the flesh? Harry thought for a moment. "I remember that when we were skinning it, the beast seemed bony. But its muscles were well defined, like those of a strong predator. The blood was thick and almost black, but we thought it was because of the cold. We didn't notice any unusual smell. Honestly, we were all in high spirits back then. Songs, dancing, someone had already drunk some hot punch. Maybe if it weren't for that atmosphere, I might have noticed the oddities. But gradually I learned new details. It turned out that almost all the residents tasted the meat, except for some women and children, those who preferred other flavors or, for example, had already eaten enough of the other treats. Interestingly, almost everyone who is sick today confirmed that they ate that game, while those who didn't eat it either didn't get infected or have minimal symptoms. This detail fit neatly into a clear pattern. Something in that meat could have been a carrier of the infection or a parasite. I asked a direct question. "Is there anything left of that carcass? Bones, head, hide? I need to take samples." Harry shrugged. After the festival, people took what they could and threw away the remains. Someone said that the most useless parts were taken deep into the forest so as not to attract wolves to the village. I heard that Hunter Flynn wanted to keep the hide as a trophy, but then seemed to give up because the fur was tough and smelled bad, and no one knew how to process it properly. Maybe he burned it. After talking with Harry, it became clear to me that the threads of my investigation led directly to the mysterious beast that no one in the village had seen before. I needed to somehow obtain samples, and if they weren't available, perhaps find traces at the location where Flynn shot the animal. "Ask Flynn for more details," Harry suggested. He said the beast lunged at him somewhere at the foot of the hills to the west. Maybe the bones of its companions are still there. This idea seemed a bit crazy to me. Could there still be similar beasts living there? But there was no choice. I had to check all options. I found Flynn in the evening. At first he objected. "Why do you need to go there? There's nothing to do there in winter. It's too cold and dangerous." But then, hearing my arguments about needing to save people, he agreed to take me to where he said he saw several animal skeletons. "There's a cave," he reported. "I think the beast lived nearby. But I didn't go in myself. I only saw the bones out of the corner of my eye." The thought of what kind of lair might be deep within the rocks made me shiver. But for the sake of a diagnosis, I was ready to risk a lot. Thus, I formed a hypothesis that the disease might have started from the contaminated meat, and was likely spreading through direct contact with carriers or their excretions. There were no laboratory confirmations yet, but I saw how the condition of some patients was worsening. They began to complain of severe headaches, nausea, and a few developed new, more serious symptoms: fever and seizures. Meanwhile, whispers about a curse started circulating among the villagers. People constantly asked me, "Doctor, can this really be cured? Are we not facing something terrible?" I tried to reassure them, but inside a bad feeling was growing. When evening came and I finally sat by the fireplace at Marshall's to warm up a bit, thoughts of Joseph resurfaced. Could it be that he knew everything in advance? Why was his letter so brief, without details? Where is he now? I had already decided that in the morning I would go to that cave with Flynn. Perhaps I would find clues that would help determine the nature of this terrible affliction. That night, I fell asleep uneasily, trying not to think about the increasing number of sick people and the fact that any day of delay could lead to a catastrophe. In the deep silence, I imagined someone wandering outside, quiet footsteps crunching through the snow, then fading away. But when I looked out the window, I saw only moonlight on the empty street. Maybe it was just my imagination, exhausted by fear and a sense of responsibility? Or was someone really watching me, waiting for me to take another step toward the solution? At dawn, Flynn and I set out. The weather had turned cold again, so much so that my cheeks and nose began to numb the moment I peeked out from under the blanket. I grabbed a flashlight, a few candles, and a small pouch with medical supplies, alcohol, bandages, a small scalpel, and sample tubes. Flynn armed himself with a rifle and a long hunting knife. He looked like someone who really didn't want to go to this place, but his duty to the village compelled him. I could feel the fear lurking in his soul about what we might discover there. The journey took no less than an hour. We left the settlement, turned onto a narrow path that first wound through the forest, and then began to climb higher up the rocky slope. The snow here wasn't as deep, but the incline made walking difficult. Feet slipped, and we had to rely on protruding roots and stones for support. Flynn kept stopping periodically, scanning the surrounding area, as if expecting another mysterious beast to appear. I, on the other hand, tried to walk carefully to avoid falling, while also peering into the gloomy gray cliffs. Occasionally, pine cones crackled in the wind, and fallen cones lay scattered along the trail. Finally, we reached a small crevice in the rock, behind which a dark abyss opened up. Off to the side, something resembling a wide fissure became visible. It was the very cave we were looking for. "Doctor, it's better not to go too far," Flynn warned. "It might be slippery inside, and we don't know who or what lives there. I once saw a predatory lynx there, or maybe something worse." But I had no choice. If this cave indeed held the remains of similar beasts, I was obligated to collect bone samples. We entered, and I turned on the flashlight. The warm yellow light revealed stone walls covered with mold and some kind of streaks. The cave floor was uneven, strewn with stone rubble and dirty snow blown in by the wind. However, just a few steps from the entrance, it became noticeably warmer. The piercing wind barely reached us. Flynn moved forward with his rifle slung over his shoulder, and I followed, striving not to miss any details. In the depths, I could hear a soft dripping sound. Water seeping from the vaults, falling into puddles and creating a ghostly echo. After walking a couple dozen meters, we stumbled upon a pile of bones. My breath caught at the sight. Many had been gnawed by time and possibly other animals. But among the debris, skulls and large bones were clearly visible, some strangely deformed. I crouched down and shone the flashlight. One of the skulls resembled that of a wolf, but the jaw was disproportionately long, and the teeth seemed larger than those of ordinary wolves. I'd only seen such teeth in textbooks for large predators, and even then, not always. Another smaller skull could have belonged to a coyote or a fox, but it also looked abnormal. Fused bony growths, almost like spikes. Fur was scattered everywhere, already half decayed and soaked with moisture. The smell was heavy and putrid, though the cold winter air tried to mask it. I took out a clean cloth and carefully wrapped several bones, taking them as samples. I looked at Flynn. He was paling. "This is... Damn it, Doctor," the hunter cursed, staring at the remains. "I don't know what kind of creatures lived here, but definitely nothing good. Damn it, Doctor. And we ate one of these." His voice carried both disgust and fear. I could understand how horrifying it was to realize that at one point he had eaten the meat of a creature that might have been mutated or infected by something. It was truly terrifying. I noticed another pile of bones against the wall. There was a skull fragment, even more deformed, with protruding cheekbones and a torn frontal bone. Perhaps the animals fought each other, or maybe it was the result of some other circumstances. But the fact remained. Inside this cave was the lair of creatures that clearly differed from the familiar species of wild fauna. The twisted, irregular bone structures suggested diseases, mutations, or some hellish mix of both. While I was extracting a small scalpel to carefully separate bone fragments from the frozen ground, Flynn suddenly tensed and sharply raised his rifle. "Shh," he whispered. "I heard something." We both froze, hearing muffled sounds, like the rustling of footsteps in a distant corridor of the cave. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps someone was really wandering deeper inside. My heart stopped, and I felt fear creeping into my bones, just like the ice beneath our feet. "Let's get out of here, Doctor," Flynn whispered. I nodded, feeling that there was nothing more for us to do here. I had already taken the necessary samples. Delving further into the dark tunnels where a living monster might be hiding would have been reckless. Neither of us had enough equipment or people to feel safe. We quickly packed up our things and, trying not to make any noise, moved toward the exit. I carried the bundle of bones in my bag like a trophy earned at the cost of my own cold-bloodedness. The closer we got to the light at the entrance, the more relief I felt. The frosty air outside stung our faces, but it was better than the cold of the cave, permeated with the smell of death. "This is madness, Doctor," Flynn said when we moved to a safe distance. "What are we going to do now? You don't think there's an entire pack of these beasts around here, do you?" I tried to calm him, saying that we didn't know exactly how long those remains had been in the cave, and that it wasn't certain there were still living specimens there. But deep down, I was trembling at the thought that we might have only scratched the surface of a much larger problem. On the way back, Flynn kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting another creature to jump out from around the bend. I walked ahead, overwhelmed by mixed emotions: fear, disgust, and a certain grim determination. I needed to study these bones as soon as possible, even though it was almost impossible in the village conditions. But at least I could try to identify their species and assess whether there were any parasites or signs of disease on them. Upon returning, I discovered that even more people in the village had fallen ill, and those who were already sick had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Did anyone offer me help? Yes, but it wasn't enough. People were trying to hold on, but panic was in the air. It was then that I realized we absolutely needed to return to the cave to learn more. Without additional information, we would continue to wander in guesses, and the disease would keep claiming everyone who had tasted the suspicious meat. Perhaps the answers lay deep within the cave. The next day, I persuaded Flynn to accompany me again. He was initially reluctant, saying things like, "We've already seen the scariest things, and going further is like plunging into death." But my argument that without this, we were doomed convinced him otherwise. At dawn, we prepared our gear: flashlights, some provisions, ropes, and a hunting rifle in case we encountered predators. My legs were shaking even before we set out. These cold, gloomy forests, the snowdrifts, and most importantly, the very thought of returning to the lair of inhuman creatures. But fear had to be overcome. We followed the same trail as last time. The forest seemed gloomier. Thick fog enveloped the tree trunks, and branches creaked in the cold wind. Flynn barely spoke. Only occasionally would he exchange glances with me, as if silently asking, "Maybe we should turn back." But I stubbornly pressed forward. After an hour, we reached the familiar black abyss, the entrance to the cave. Putting on gloves and checking our flashlights, we entered, and the cold, damp walls enveloped us, as if warning us. Inside it was quiet, except for the dripping of water from the ceiling. We carefully made our way across the slippery floor, illuminating our path. I wanted to delve into the deeper passages that we hadn't managed to explore last time. That's where the key might lie. Perhaps the nests of these creatures, remnants of other slain beasts or even people. Suddenly, around one of the turns, we encountered a narrow fissure in the rock through which we barely squeezed, finding ourselves in a spacious grotto with a stone ledge on the edge. Below, a deep pit yawned. "Look, Doctor," Flynn whispered, pointing his flashlight downward. "If anything's wrong, I didn't notice it before. It seems you can only descend here with a rope." We exchanged anxious glances. I was about to suggest going down when I heard a dull thud from below. These sounds were definitely not like animal growls, more like rustling mixed with soft knocks, as if someone was desperately trying to climb up. My heart tightened. Who could be there? I wanted to shout, "Hey, are you alive?" But I was afraid of attracting the attention of a possible enemy. Suddenly, muffled words came from below. "Is anyone there? Help? I hear voices up here?" I exchanged a frightened look with Flynn, but curiosity and hope prevailed, and I shouted, "We're here! Who are you?" A response didn't come immediately. There was a rustling below, then a dim flashlight beam appeared. I took a step back, ready to run if something horrible emerged from the darkness. But from the half-light emerged a person, a thin, emaciated man with scratched hands. He looked like a villager, only dirty and exhausted. His face seemed strangely familiar, but I couldn't recall where I'd seen him. Flynn exclaimed with relief in his voice, "John, we thought you were missing, buddy. Damn it! How did you end up here?" I squinted involuntarily, trying to figure out why I had the feeling that I knew this person. Through the grime and overgrown stubble, familiar features emerged. He looked up, and in the flashlight's light, our eyes met. His eyes widened, and a flash of recognition crossed his face. "Doctor," he breathed out. "Could it be you're really here?" I blinked, and suddenly something clicked inside me. Standing before me was Joseph Blackthorne, the very person whose letter had pulled me into this wilderness, but whom I had unsuccessfully searched for since my arrival. I couldn't understand why he was being called John until he spoke, interrupting our silence. "Forgive me, Doctor. I didn't want the locals to know my real name. In the village, I introduced myself as John," he said, breathing heavily. "But when I realized the trouble here, I sent you a letter, hoping you'd reach in time to help." Flynn gave me a puzzled look. He clearly didn't understand anything. "So you're not John?" So you're the same Joseph? Then why lie? I'll explain everything later, Joseph replied, his voice trembling. Right now, the main thing is to get out. I came down here a few days ago. I wanted to scout out what was hiding in these tunnels. I took provisions and a flashlight with me, but the maze of passages turned out to be enormous. I got lost and almost died of hunger. Luckily, I had enough supplies for a few days, and these creatures wandered deeper. I heard their howls, saw their shadows. They're terrifying, Doctor. I can swear they're not ordinary animals. I helped him climb up, seating him on a flat stone. Flynn gave him some water, and I began to examine his wounds. Fortunately, they were shallow. While I was bandaging him, Joseph explained that after arriving here, a few days before my arrival, he tried to determine the source of the disease and suspected that the beast from the cave was just the tip of the iceberg. He noticed strange writings or drawings on the walls, and the labyrinth, according to him, breathes something ancient and evil. I think something involved here is older than all of us, he whispered, looking at the dark abyss beneath our feet. I sighed and asked him what we should do now, but he didn't know the answer. Essentially, neither did I. We were facing something unknown, and no one knew how to combat the disease. There was nothing to do, and we decided to return. We escaped the cave, constantly looking back. It seemed like foreign eyes were watching us from the depths. Thus, we emerged into the biting wind, rejoicing in the daylight, no matter how dim it was. The journey took less time than usual, partly because we were in a hurry, as if we felt that something terrible could happen in the village. On the way, I managed to ask Joseph about the reasons that prompted him to hide his identity. So that Flynn wouldn't hear, he quietly said that he had problems with the authorities. He punched a guy in a bar, and that guy turned out to be the mayor's son. Then they decided to hang all the dogs on him, and he had no choice but to start hiding in this wilderness. Upon hearing this, I just nodded. I knew he was a good guy, so I didn't judge him. When we emerged from the thicket, we saw smoke in the distance. It was too much for ordinary chimneys. Thick black clouds were rising above the houses. My heart skipped a beat with anxiety. As if confirming my fears, muffled cries came from there. Flynn grabbed his rifle and Joseph clenched his fists. We quickened our pace. It seemed the village had descended into chaos. At several houses, doors were wide open. Bloody stains were visible on the snow here and there, and from afar, women's wails could be heard. I rushed toward the voice, and we found that someone from the locals was lying right at the doorstep of his house, barely breathing. "Doctor," moaned a woman, whom I recognized as Mrs. Walsh. He collapsed. Fever, fire inside. I knelt down before her husband, Mr. Walsh. He was delirious. His eyes shone feverishly. His pulse was irregular, his skin burned. I asked Joseph to bring water, but he quickly looked around. There was no water nearby except for a pitiful bucket with remnants. We poured the remaining water into his mouth, at least so he wouldn't die from dehydration. At that moment, another scream came from somewhere on the right. "Doctor, come quickly!" I glanced at Joseph. "Help them, I'm coming!" and rushed toward the screams. In one of the alleys, I saw a young boy convulsing, held by two relatives by the hands. The boy had foam at his mouth, shouting incoherent words. "Soon? Everything is over?" I tried to administer a sedative from my small first aid kit. After the injection, the convulsions began to subside, but I understood that this was only temporary relief. Soon we realized that in the few hours we were away, the disease had made a huge leap forward. Half of the residents were complaining of severe weakness and fever. Some were on the verge of madness. The infirmary we had set up 2 days ago was overcrowded. My assistant, Dolores, she hadn't eaten that meat and remained healthy. And I tried to care for the most severe cases, but it was almost hopeless. Moreover, the supply of medications was rapidly dwindling. I noted that Joseph had stepped into the role of my assistant, helping to carry water, bandaging wounds, giving advice, and soothing patients. As I was attending to new patients, I was piecing together the facts in my mind. The disease hadn't intensified so quickly for no reason. Perhaps a climax was approaching, when the bodies of the infected would move into the next stage. I had suspected something like this before, but now I felt that it could turn into a real catastrophe. At Marshall's suggestion, we began relocating the most aggressive, those who were already delirious and attacking people, to an old barn. This was done both to prevent them from injuring themselves and others, and to isolate the source of the infection if necessary. An atmosphere of panic reigned throughout the village. Some were crying, begging me to find a cure. Others huddled in groups, whispering about a curse. Some, more religious, were calling upon God for help, while others had lost all hope. Isolating the sick remained our only tool for containment. But I saw. The disease had already infiltrated everyone who had ever touched that wild flesh. That evening, when we were exhausted sitting on a bench at the infirmary, Joseph suddenly quietly said, "Doctor, I forgot to say." As I was walking through the underground tunnels, I saw cave paintings depicting some sort of half-beasts. Maybe these aren't new creatures, but ancient evil, as I thought. I'm afraid it's awakened now. We're playing with fire. I closed my eyes, shuddering at the thought that we were likely facing not just a virus or a parasite, but something that goes beyond conventional medicine. The night began with a cold wind and a clear sky. When the moon appeared above the treetops, it illuminated the village with a ghostly light, sending an unpleasant shiver through my soul. I remembered that tonight was a full moon. Usually people paid little attention to it, but after everything I had witnessed, I felt uneasy. It was as if nature itself was hinting that something dreadful would unfold tonight. Joseph and I stayed to guard the infirmary where the relatively calm patients were lying. In the old barn, we had already locked up about a dozen residents who were exhibiting aggression and delirium. A couple of strong local guys stood watch there to ensure that no one escaped. At one point closer to midnight, I noticed that several of the sick were experiencing intensified convulsions and an unusual gleam in their eyes. Their temperatures had risen so high that touching them was terrifying, as if they were burning embers. They stopped responding to questions, breathing in gasps and emitting prolonged sounds more akin to wheezing. I felt sweat trickle down my temples. Something was happening, and these changes were decidedly not in our favor. "Doctor," whispered Dolores, my assistant and healer, touching my hand. "I'm scared. They're acting like they don't recognize us. Look at them." I approached a woman named Mrs. Scott. She looked up at me with dilated pupils, her lips slightly parted, emitting a soft moan. When I tried to speak to her, she suddenly grabbed my hand with a ferocious strength and hissed something incoherent. I barely tore her fingers from my sleeve, realizing that an ordinary woman couldn't possess such a grip. My pulse quickened and I recoiled, sensing something was terribly wrong. At that very moment, screams erupted outside. I glanced through the infirmary window and saw a man running out of a neighboring house, followed by a figure staggering and baring its teeth, a creature resembling a wolf on its hind legs but with human proportions. I dropped my flashlight in horror. These signs were familiar from tales of werewolves, but what I was witnessing now seemed worse than any legend. A creature with a contorted face, covered in patches of fur, was gasping for air convulsively and growling. The man panicked and fled, but the beast leapt after him. A wild screech echoed through the air. I grabbed Dolores by the hand. "Run to the barn immediately, check what's there, I'll join you soon." Dolores nodded, trembling with fear. She dashed out. At the doorstep, she collided with Joseph, who was returning from a neighboring house. He had seen everything and exclaimed, "Lord, it's begun." We merely exchanged glances, understanding that we were powerless against this phenomenon. In the infirmary, where the weaker patients were lying, something terrible began to unfold as well. A couple of patients who couldn't stand up earlier now seemed infused with wild strength. I heard bones cracking. One, right before my eyes, started contorting, twisting into an unnatural pose. I saw his fingers elongate, nails turning into claws. His eyes filled with red, and he let out a painful howl that made my hair stand on end. With each passing second, this creature lost its human appearance. Patches of skin were covered with coarse fur. His neck stretched, and his jaw and nose fused together, forming something like a beast's snout. "No, no," I muttered, backing away toward the door. I tried to recall any medical knowledge that could explain such a metamorphosis, but found nothing reasonable. It was beyond the bounds of conventional understanding. I pressed my back against the wall, trying not to be seen, but he still noticed me. The newly transformed creature turned its head, and in the dim light, its eyes glowed with an amber, malicious gleam. I felt someone clutch my shoulder desperately. Turning around, I saw Flynn. He had been with us from the very beginning, helping with the evacuation, clutching his rifle tightly just a minute ago. But now his face was pale, eyes clouded, breathing raggedly. He was whispering something indistinct, as if struggling against an invisible force. "Doctor, something is happening," he croaked, and suddenly his legs gave out. "Flynn!" I shouted, rushing to him, but immediately recoiled. His body was already beginning to change. He writhed on the floor, pressing his hands to his chest, guttural growls escaping his throat. I watched as his fingers lengthened, nails turning into sharp claws. Flynn's face twisted, his jawbones snapping forward and stretching. His skin was dotted with patches of dark fur. It was a monstrous sight and all too familiar after what I had already seen. In an instant, he arched his back as if trying to resist the transformation one last time, then collapsed to the floor. When he raised his head, my partner was no longer there. His amber eyes gleamed with wild malice, his jaws with protruding fangs clamped shut with a dull click. The newly formed beast lifted its head and let out a prolonged howl that made my legs feel like they were glued to the floor. The creature that had once been Flynn stood on its paws, ears pinned back in menace. Its gaze darted toward me. I froze, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. At the same time, another creature's growl echoed from the infirmary corner. I was caught between two monsters, ready to tear me apart. I was fortunate that at that moment, Joseph burst into the infirmary, wielding a long stick. He distracted the creature by shouting, "Hey, monster, come here!" The wolfman lunged at him, and Joseph deftly dodged, trying to maintain distance. I realized we were in mortal danger, but we had to escape. Somehow, we shoved him together, knocking over a cabinet filled with medicines. The beast howled, and we took advantage of the distraction to jump outside. There was true hell outside. Judging by the screams, similar transformations had begun in different parts of the village. I noticed dark silhouettes prowling between houses, heard chilling howls. Ordinary people who had begged for help half a day ago had now turned into wild creatures capable of tearing anyone's throat. Perhaps not everyone had fully transformed, but those exposed to the moonlight clearly carried the beast gene. The frost stung me even more than the cold air. These creatures were not just wolves. They resembled that mysterious beast from which it all began, distorted, larger, with bony growths. Amidst the chaos, Joseph and I spotted Tommy running toward us with a bewildered face. He was holding a rifle, but his eyes were filled with panic. "Doctor, they broke down the barn door from inside, killed 2 guys trying to hold them back. They're no longer human." I looked around, my heart aching with pain. So many I had tried to save were now roaming the streets, having lost their human form and consciousness. Cries and growls mingled as people panicked, some calling out for their loved ones, only to hear the beast's snarls in response. Hiding in houses was useless. The creatures easily broke down doors. "We need to leave," I whispered, feeling nausea rise in my throat. "You're suggesting we abandon everyone?" Tommy exploded. I only gave him a bitter look. "What do you suggest? If we stay, they'll tear us apart. Gather everyone who's still healthy." Desperately, we darted through the village, picking up the remaining healthy, my assistant Dolores, another man. Some couldn't move a muscle out of fear. Others ran on their own. Everywhere there was a crackling sound, animal screams and humans' dying cries. The moon hung above us like a cold witness to this massacre. I was on the brink of madness, but knew we wouldn't survive here. Thus began our terrifying exodus from what I once considered a quiet and peaceful settlement. Our escape began under the flickering moonlight, which seemed to illuminate all our fears. We, a handful of survivors, me, Joseph, Tommy, my assistant Dolores, and another man. The other healthy ones had either fled in panic or been killed by the creatures. Just minutes separated us from encountering another werewolf, of which there were plenty prowling the village. We ran out into the snowy street, trying to stay close to the walls of the houses. Screams and howls behind us reminded us of the complete chaos that had engulfed the settlement. Somewhere doors and shutters were breaking, walls shaking from blows. It seemed the monsters were searching for the remaining people to tear them apart. I tried not to think about those who might still be wandering the homes in search of salvation, ordinary women, children. But a voice echoed in my head. "I am a doctor. I can't leave." And at the same time, another thought, "Stay. You'll die, and no one can help." I barely held back tears when a woman with a child ran past us, screaming in terror. A moment later, a creature jumped out from the side, and their screams were cut off. We couldn't help, no matter how hard we tried. "This way," whispered Joseph, pointing to a side alley. We moved toward it, crouching down. I heard one of our own breathing heavily, gasping from cold and fear. Dolores injured her leg. She tripped and fell onto a rock. Joseph supported her by the arm, and I kept looking around, trying not to lose sight of the dark silhouettes. One of the creatures flashed at the end of the alley, sensing us. I saw its snarling face in the moonlight, and uneven growths along its spine. My heart sank. Another second, and it would leap. But Tommy fortunately shot. The monster howled, apparently wounded in the side, but not dead. It just backed around the corner, growling. Our group managed to turn the other way before it recovered. We ran between the houses like frightened deer. Finally, we reached the outskirts of the village, where the forest began behind the last houses. The pursuit was relentless. At one point, when we were almost out onto the trail, the man walking with us panicked and sprinted straight through a wasteland. I wanted to shout at him to come back, but it was too late. A creature jumped out from the darkness, knocking him to the ground. A terrifying screech pierced our ears. Joseph grabbed my sleeve. "Run, or we all die!" It was hard to realize that the only chance was to leave the unfortunate one behind. But a harsh truth echoed in my head. It was either us or death. So we, gritting our teeth, hid under the cover of the dark forest. Branches and snow crunched underfoot, and somewhere behind us, screams could still be heard. I thought I saw eyes peering from the tree branches, but maybe it was just my imagination fueled by events. We didn't know if the monsters had a sense of smell like wolves, whether they could find us by our tracks. But there was no other way. "What next, Doctor?" whispered Dolores, clutching her injured leg. "We can't keep running forever." "We need to get to the trail," I replied, looking back at Joseph and Tommy. "From there, try to reach the nearest town. Warn the authorities, the military, anyone." Tommy sighed heavily. "I doubt anyone will believe us. And the road isn't nearby." "We have no other choice," Joseph spoke. "I saw them in the caves, and now you see what they've done to people. If we don't stop it, they could spread beyond the forest." And although we understood that we might face death from hunger, cold, or the monster's claws, we still moved forward. With each minute, walking became harder. Deep snow, wounds, and adrenaline burning our last strength. In several places we heard faint growls and creaks behind the trees, so we moved as quietly as possible. I remembered how, just a few days ago, I was walking peacefully on this trail, discussing the strange game with Flynn. Who would have thought that soon I would be running from a whole pack of anomalous werewolves? Almost an hour of wandering later, we reached a frozen stream where we took a break. I searched my bag for bandages, helped to wrap Dolores' scratch more securely. Everyone was silent. We could only guess if we were being pursued. We flinched at every sound, leaning on rifles and knives. However, no one appeared. Perhaps the creatures continued their slaughter in the village and the forest wasn't yet of interest to them, but we weren't going to stay to check it out. "There's an old trail here," Tommy finally spoke. "If we go northeast, we'll reach a hunting cabin. My friend kept it. Maybe there are supplies and fuel left there." We nodded in agreement. We had to move somewhere, and every minute of delay was dangerous. My heart was breaking as we left the village. But we were helpless against these monsters. If we could reach civilization and bring help, it was our only chance to help the survivors. And what if someone else was still hiding and waiting for rescue? So we moved further, trying to avoid open spaces. The forest rustled. The frost bit my cheeks. Along the way, we occasionally noticed untouched wild animal tracks, but to our relief, we didn't see any human tracks besides our own. Soon, the dark silhouettes of the trees around us thickened, and we realized we had delved into the thicket, a dense area, almost impassable in winter. And yet this path was better than the direct road, where the monsters could catch us. By the time the moon began to set towards the horizon, we were still trudging forward. Exhaustion became monstrous. Even my legs could barely hold, and Dolores had a throbbing wound. Finally, someone let out a joyful breath. Ahead, a dark structure loomed against the hillside. Approaching closer, we saw a creaky sign on the porch, the hunting cabin Tom was talking about. It was clear it hadn't been used for several seasons. Windows were dust-covered. The door was crooked. After checking that no one was inside, we cautiously entered. Inside, it smelled of old wood and mustiness, but it was at least some shelter. There were still logs in the fireplace. Tommy immediately started stoking them, and Joseph and I inspected the rooms. Hunger reminded me of itself. My stomach growled and my mouth was dry. Fortunately, in a dusty cabinet, we found a jar of pickled vegetables and some crackers. Better than nothing. The whole group settled around the barely warming fire. For a moment, we allowed ourselves the luxury to relax. Exhausted to the limit, we had secured this small island of safety in the middle of the night forest nightmare. It was hard to realize that just an hour ago we heard the last screams of those dying in the village. Now our goal was one: survive and warn others. And although we understood that unknown monsters could find us here too, we tried at least to give our bodies and weary souls a brief rest. No one knew what awaited us beyond the next dawn. 2 days later, we finally reached a small town on the edge of the state. And to say that no one believed us is an understatement. When we, exhausted, in clothes stained with blood and dirt, recounted what had happened, the local sheriff looked at us as if before him was a gang of alcoholics raving about monsters. But as soon as he saw our injured Dolores and the claw marks on Tommy's body, doubt flickered in his gaze. Fortunately, there was a small private clinic in town where we took Dolores. The local hospital doctor initially didn't understand what was happening, but seeing the torn wounds, admitted that they were definitely not from an ordinary beast. While Dolores and Tommy were recovering, Joseph, Flynn, and I sat all evening in the sheriff's office, recording the protocol. We told them everything: how the strange disease broke out in the village, how people gradually lost their human form, and then staged a massacre. The sheriff called in the nurse and the pharmacist one by one to examine our scars and confirm that the matter was serious. Maybe he didn't fully believe in werewolves, but he realized it was an extremely dangerous situation. Closer to night, 2 officers from a neighboring larger city arrived looking like military men and began interrogating us more harshly. I explained that our main goal was to return to the site with a team of armed men to check the village, help if anyone survived, and isolate the cave. Listening to this, the officers merely grimly nodded. One of them, introducing himself as Captain Hardy, asked me, "Are you sure this isn't just a rabies outbreak among wolves? People in panic could have mistaken dogs or wolves for werewolves." "Sir," Joseph intervened, "I saw human bones changing right before my eyes. This isn't rabies. Please, believe us, we're not insane." Captain Hardy remained silent for a long time, examining us with Joseph. Then, seemingly making a decision, he said, "All right, tomorrow morning we'll assemble a group of soldiers. A doctor will come with you to confirm your words on site, but I warn you, if it turns out to be a fabrication—" He didn't finish, but the tone made it clear. There would be consequences. It didn't scare me because we were telling the truth. The next day, near the town square, 2 military trucks were assembled. On one of them, I saw a doctor named Wilkins whom I had spoken to beforehand. He had specifically armed himself with a set of ampules, bandaging materials, and other medical supplies, preparing for the worst. We were offered to stay in town. Supposedly, you are already exhausted. But I refused. Without me, no one could show the exact path to the village and the cave. Tommy also volunteered, as he knew the forest, and Joseph insisted he had to go. Felt it was his duty to help stop this evil. The road took half a day. Captain Hardy noticed that the access roads to the village were almost impassable due to the snowfall. We had to leave the trucks and continue on foot in a column. The soldiers kept their weapons ready. Officers shouted commands. I felt a strange nervousness. Maybe we're going into a dead zone, or maybe not. When we approached the village, we were met with a truly gruesome sight, though different from the hell we saw running away. There was complete silence here. No rustling, no sounds of life. The houses stood empty, like cardboard models. Fallen fences around, dark stains on the walls in places. I ran my finger over one. Blood, dried and almost black. But no bodies. And no signs of huge paws or claws on the snow since enough precipitation had fallen to cover old tracks. It was as if everything had vanished without a trace. We entered the infirmary, where not long ago I was trying to treat the sick. The beds were empty, only some bloodstains and torn sheets here and there. In the corridor, bandages lay scattered. No signs of life. I heard one of the soldiers muttering under his breath, and another taking out a camera to document everything. Captain Hardy stared at me silently, surely suspecting that I had exaggerated. But I showed him the signs of disorder: blood, broken doors, shattered windows. This couldn't have happened by chance, I repeated, and he grudgingly agreed. Joseph decided to check the barn where we had isolated the aggressive ones. The scene was even scarier. Burnt logs, a collapsed roof, and inside, chaos, torn clothing, iron chains with which we had tried to bind some of the sick, all in blood, but no bodies. I saw Joseph flinch, clenching his fists. He realized none of us likely survived. Either they transformed into monsters and left, or someone took them away. Or perhaps something even worse. Then the military moved to the cave. I was taken into a small squad of 5 people, including an officer, Captain Hardy, and Dr. Wilkins. Tommy walked alongside, quietly holding a rifle. We reached the entrance to the cave, stumbling upon a hidden path covered with snow along the way. Inside, everything looked almost the same as during our previous visit. The same vaults, the same damp cold. Only where I had examined bones before, now there were only debris and scattered fragments. Someone had clearly been touching them, maybe taking them away. Dr. Wilkins tried to collect samples, but little remained. As we delved further, the officers noticed that the cave branched into several corridors. "We need specialists and good weapons here," someone in the soldiers muttered, inspecting the dark abysses. "We can't make do with just flashlights." We didn't encounter any creatures, no signs of life at all, just deafening silence and the echo of our footsteps. After about 2 hours, we surfaced, finding nothing but a few bones, reminders of the tragedy. Then Captain Hardy declared that the entire area needed to be cordoned off, and the state authorities would make decisions on further measures. I was ordered to return to the town and not share details with anyone. Joseph, although he wanted to stay for research, was also sent back under the pretext of confidentiality. As if by a snap of fingers, the government took control of the case. Soon some agents in dark suits appeared, hinting that this story was not to be disclosed, so as not to provoke panic. Our group had to sign non-disclosure papers. We saw the military setting up posts and barricades, then even telling the locals that this was a dangerous zone, an outbreak of an unknown epidemic. No admissions of monstrous werewolves. Everything was strictly closed. We were only told that we would be thanked for our cooperation and sent to different places. Doctors and surviving witnesses will receive medical help and rehabilitation. It sounded like a sentence. It was as if they were lulling us with assurances that everything would be fine. After those events, Joseph, Flynn, and I were sent to a safe place, the same town we had initially reached, and given rooms in a hotel. We were under the unspoken supervision of agents who didn't allow us to disclose details of what had happened. Dolores was being treated at the clinic, recovering. I visited her daily to make sure her condition was stable. No one asked about the epidemic. The town lived its own life, and only rare rumors about a quarantine in a remote area circulated among the locals, but no one suspected that there had been a massacre involving monsters. I noticed that Joseph was longing to tell the truth. He spoke with me, saying he would like to return to the caves to finish the job. But it was impossible. The authorities had taken control of everything, and blockades had been set up around the village. Naturally, we couldn't even get close. Tommy, having lost almost all his acquaintances in that village, was in deep sorrow. His life had turned upside down, his home disappeared, and everyone he knew had either died or disappeared without a trace. He spent days silently sitting by the window, watching the bustling human figures who had no idea of the evil lurking in the forests. When Dolores recovered and was discharged from the clinic, I tried to discuss further plans with her. Maybe we could move to another state, away from this nightmare. But she, like most survivors, remained in a suspended state. "I can't just leave everything," she repeated. But she was also afraid to break the military and agents' prohibitions, as if some invisible force kept us here. And we waited to see what would happen next. A week later, representatives of neither the Army nor the Special Service arrived. They conducted lengthy conversations, asked us to describe everything we saw, and made us sign non-disclosure documents again. I felt the real reason. They wanted to handle the anomaly on their own. In the end, one of them, a gruff middle-aged man, quietly said to me, "Thank you for your cooperation, Doctor. We'll take care of the situation from here. If you don't need any additional help, you can return to your former life. We will keep in touch with you." These words sounded frightening. "We'll take care of it ourselves." It seemed that government structures were not just planning to treat the disease, but perhaps wanted to study the phenomenon or use it for their own purposes. I remembered the gaze of those creatures when they chased us and shuddered. Who knows what could come out of experiments with such evil? Before we could recover, rumors began to spread in the town. Authorities reported the elimination of the infection center. The situation is under control. No reason for panic. Clearly, they covered everything up. About the village, they said that residents have been evacuated. I doubted that anyone had survived there besides us, but no official information was provided. Finally, by spring, it became clear that there would be no official investigation with public reports. We were allowed to leave the town, advised to focus on life and health. Meanwhile, several soldiers directly told us, "You shouldn't return there. It's now a closed zone." Joseph shook my hand and suggested meeting in the future if we managed to conduct an independent investigation of what happened. I agreed, but felt a strange emptiness in my soul. They essentially ordered us to remain silent, and the entire village, all those unfortunate people, were swallowed by a deep secret. Since then, at the place where the cave was, there has been a military base, and even after 60 years, no one is allowed in, and only I, who survived those events, know what happened there.